I woke up to the sound of solid oak splintering. It was exactly 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, and someone was violently taking a sledgehammer to my front door. This was not a random break-in. The voices drifting through the crisp morning air were painfully, devastatingly familiar. It was my own son, Marcus, and his wife, Chloe, and they had brought a stranger with them to do the dirty work. I lay in my bed for a long moment, simply listening to the rhythmic, deafening thuds echoing through the walls. The heavy oak door of my ancestral home had stood firm for over 8 decades. It was a testament to the resilience of the people who built this house, my grandparents who had worked multiple jobs just to afford a piece of property in a redlined district. Now my own flesh and blood was paying someone to destroy it. I could hear Marcus screaming from the front porch, his voice cracking with that entitled rage I had spent years trying to correct. "Open the door right now. I am getting in no matter what. This is my house." Then came Chloe's voice, shrill and dripping with that condescending, passive-aggressive tone she usually reserved just for me. "Marcus, stop yelling and just tell Todd to break the deadbolt. She has no right to be in there anymore. We have the legal paperwork, Todd." Whoever he was grunted heavily as another massive blow rained down on the reinforced wood. The sheer audacity of it all did not make me scream. It did not make me reach for the phone to call the police in a panic. It made me smile. A cold, calculated smile. They thought they had backed a helpless, senile woman into a corner. They thought they had outsmarted me. They had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into a federal trap I had spent the last month carefully laying out for them. My name is Evelyn, and I am 62 years old. For 30 years I worked as the Director of Tax and Zoning for this city. I know every property line, every environmental loophole, and every federal mandate in this county. I built my entire career navigating the cutthroat sharks of the commercial real estate world. I simply never expected the deadliest sharks to be swimming in my own gene pool. Have you ever watched the child you nurtured, the boy you sacrificed everything for, turn into a monster fueled by someone else's greed? Have you ever had to look your own son in the eye and realize that the only way to save your legacy is to utterly destroy his? Before I tell you exactly how this nightmare unfolded, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to close the door on toxic family members to protect your peace. Trust me, you will want to stick around to hear how I used the very laws my daughter-in-law tried to exploit to hand her the absolute worst reality check of her miserable life. I slowly threw off my heavy quilt and stood up. The hardwood floorboards under my bare feet were cool and familiar. My late husband, God rest his soul, had sanded and polished these floors himself when we were young and full of dreams. Marcus was raised on these very floors. He took his first steps in the hallway they were currently trying to demolish. I remember holding Marcus when he was a newborn, rocking him to sleep in the very room they were trying to tear apart. I worked double shifts, studied for my certifications at the kitchen table late into the night, just to make sure he never lacked for anything. I paid for his college tuition in cash, so he would graduate without the heavy burden of student loans. I gave him a head start in life that my parents could never give me. And how did he repay me? By deciding I had lived in my own home long enough. By deciding my comfort was an obstacle to his wealth. And now he was standing outside, trying to rip the foundation out from under his own mother. Another loud crash shook the walls, rattling the picture frames on my nightstand. I did not rush. Panic is a luxury I could not afford, and frankly, they were not worth my adrenaline. I walked over to my vanity mirror, tied my silk wrap securely around my hair, and slipped into my favorite heavy cashmere robe. I took a deep breath, centering myself. I walked out of my bedroom and down the grand hallway. The sound of the sledgehammer grew louder and more aggressive with every step I took. I walked past the antique credenza that held our family photos straight into the kitchen. The kettle was already resting on the stove from when I had woken up an hour prior, fully anticipating their arrival. I turned the burner on, waiting patiently for the whistle. When it shrieked, I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, stirring in exactly 2 cubes of sugar. The silver spoon clinked softly against the delicate porcelain cup. It was a soothing, rhythmic counterpoint to the violent thuds against the front door. I carried my teacup into the spacious living room. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the stained glass windows, casting colourful, fragmented shadows across the velvet sofa and the Persian rug. I walked over to the corner of the room, reached into my robe pocket, and pulled out my smartphone. I calmly mounted it on the tripod I had set up the night before, carefully adjusting the angle to ensure the camera had a perfect, unobstructed view of the front entryway. I pressed record. A tiny red light blinked to life, silently capturing the exact moment my son decided to cross the point of no return. I wanted this documented in high definition. I needed the authorities to see the unprovoked aggression, the absolute disregard for my physical safety, and the illegal destruction of historical property. You see, the neighborhood used to be a thriving hub for black businesses and families, a place where doors were left unlocked and everyone knew your name. Now developers were sweeping through like locusts, offering pennies on the dollar to elderly residents, erasing decades of culture to build sterile coffee shops and yoga studios. Chloe fancied herself a luxury real estate developer. She was one of those locusts, but she thought she had an inside track because she married my son. She was a woman born on third base, who went through life thinking she had hit a triple. She looked at my family home, a pillar of African-American heritage in this rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, and saw nothing but dollar signs. She wanted to bulldoze my history, my memories, and my safe haven just to build a block of overpriced soulless condos. And Marcus, eager to fund his lavish lifestyle and desperate to keep his demanding wife happy, had completely sold his soul to help her do it. Another massive blow hit the door, interrupting my thoughts. The heavy frame groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the high ceilings. The brass deadbolt, which I had specially ordered and installed just 3 days ago, finally began to buckle under the sheer force of Todd's sledgehammer. He was certainly earning his dirty money today. I stood exactly 10 feet away from the entryway, perfectly still, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The warmth and sweetness bloomed on my tongue, keeping me grounded. I could hear them arguing outside again, their voices muffled but frantic. Chloe was complaining about the noise, terrified that the neighbors would wake up and call the cops before they could force me out and change the locks. Marcus was yelling at Todd, telling him to hit the door harder to stop wasting time. They were so desperate. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and entitlement. They truly thought they held all the cards because of a fake piece of paper they had fraudulently filed with the county clerk. They thought I was just a sad, lonely, confused widow who would eventually break down, cry, and surrender her only valuable asset to keep the peace. They thought I would bow to their cruelty just to maintain the illusion of a happy family. They were about to learn a masterclass in consequences. The wood around the lock finally gave way with a deafening, violent crack. A sliver of bright morning sunlight pierced through the newly broken gap in the doorframe. I watched, unblinking, as the rusted tip of a heavy crowbar jammed into the opening, ruthlessly prying the beautiful oak door away from its hinges. This was it. The moment of truth had arrived at my doorstep. But to truly understand how we got to this chaotic morning, how my own flesh and blood ended up on my porch with a hired thug and a sledgehammer, we have to go back in time. We have to rewind to exactly 1 month ago. Back to the day the masks finally slipped from their faces. Back to the traditional Sunday dinner that changed the trajectory of my family forever and set this entire war into motion. It was exactly 1 month ago, on a crisp Sunday afternoon. For as long as I can remember, Sunday dinner has been the heartbeat of our family. My mother started the tradition in this very house, and when she passed, the responsibility fell to me. I spent 2 days preparing the menu, ensuring every detail was perfect. The air in my home was thick with the rich, comforting aromas of slow-simmered collard greens, with smoked turkey tails, baked macaroni and cheese with a golden crust buttermilk fried chicken, and my grandmother's famous sweet potato pie. This house is not just a building, it is a living, breathing testament to our ancestors. The mahogany dining table we gathered around was purchased by my grandfather, in a time when a black man had to go to the back door of the furniture store just to pay for it. I polished that table until it shone like a mirror, setting it with my best fine china and the silver flatware I only bring out for family. I wanted everything to be perfect for my son, because despite his flaws, he was still my child. Then the doorbell rang, and the atmosphere in the house shifted the moment Chloe stepped over the threshold. She walked into my foyer carrying a cheap plastic grocery store container and wearing an expression that looked like she had just smelled something rotten. Marcus trailed behind her, looking down at his phone, completely oblivious to his wife's blatant disrespect. Chloe placed the plastic tub on my pristine mahogany table. It was a store-bought kale salad with absolutely no dressing, no seasoning, and no love. She looked at the feast I had spent 48 hours preparing and let out a small, condescending sigh that was designed to be heard. "Oh, Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You really went all out, did you not? I just thought we could use something a little healthier today. Soul food is so heavy. And with your age, you really need to be watching your blood pressure and your cholesterol. I brought a superfood kale blend to balance out all this grease." I looked at the dry, bitter leaves in the plastic container, and then looked at my son. Marcus was already piling a massive scoop of macaroni and cheese onto his plate, deliberately ignoring his wife's insult toward his mother. He did not say a single word in my defense. He never did. I simply smiled a tight, polite smile and told Chloe she was welcome to eat whatever she preferred. We sat down to eat, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Every bite Chloe took was accompanied by a passive-aggressive comment. She complained about the neighborhood, saying it was getting too loud and that the demographics were shifting in a way she found uncomfortable. She commented on the vintage wallpaper in my dining room, calling it outdated and suggesting it was bringing down the property value. She spoke about my home as if I were not sitting right there at the head of the table. I kept my composure, sipping my iced tea and allowing her to dig her own grave with her words. I knew something else was coming. People like Chloe do not bring up property values at a family dinner unless they are calculating their own profit. As we finished the main course, and I stood up to bring out the sweet potato pie, Chloe reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a glossy, folded brochure, and instead of handing it to me politely, she tossed it casually across the table. It landed right on top of my dinner plate, smudging against a drop of gravy. I looked down at it. The cover featured a stock photo of an elderly woman staring blankly out a window, and the bold letters read, "Sunset Meadows Assisted Living Community." I slowly looked up from the brochure and locked eyes with my daughter-in-law. I asked her what the meaning of this was, my voice perfectly level and calm. Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on my table as if she already owned the place. "Well, Evelyn," she started, Marcus, "and I have been doing a lot of thinking about your future. This house is simply too much for you to maintain. You are getting older, and it is not safe for you to be wandering around this huge place all by yourself. Sunset Meadows is a lovely facility. It is a state-funded low-income community, so your Social Security will cover most of the rent, and Marcus and I will not have to worry about you being a burden." I did not touch the brochure. I looked at her and asked exactly what would happen to my home if I moved into this lovely facility. Marcus finally looked up from his plate, clearing his throat nervously. He refused to make eye contact with me. Well, Mum, the neighborhood is rapidly gentrifying, he mumbled. Developers are buying up lots everywhere. Chloe has some incredible connections in the real estate market. We were thinking that we could take over the house. We would gut the interior, knock down these old walls, and flip the property into 3 luxury modern condos. The market value right now is around $1.5 million. If we renovate, we could double that. It is the highest and best use of the property, Mom. It is just smart business. The sheer audacity of their proposal hung in the air like a thick, choking fog. They were sitting at my table, eating the food I cooked off the plates I bought in the house I paid off completely, plotting to strip me of my independence and my generational wealth. Chloe chimed in, her tone bright and persuasive, as if she were pitching a corporate timeshare. It is a win for everyone, Evelyn. You get to rest in a community with people your own age, and Marcus and I get the seed money to start our real estate empire. You want to see your son succeed, do you not? I picked up the brochure between my thumb and index finger, treating it like a piece of toxic waste. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. Anger is a predictable emotion, and I never give my enemies what they expect. I turned my gaze entirely away from Chloe, treating her as if she were invisible, and looked directly into the eyes of the boy I raised. Marcus, I said, my voice low and commanding, echoing through the quiet dining room. Your grandfather worked double shifts in the grueling heat of a steel mill so your father could have a better life. Your father and I worked relentlessly for 30 years to pay off this mortgage, so you would always have a place to call home. This house represents our blood, our sweat, and our survival. In a world that tried to deny us everything, it is not a quick flip project for your ambitious wife. It is your family heritage. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle heavily over his shoulders before I delivered the final, absolute truth. If you want to build a real estate empire, you need to be a man and build it with your own 2 hands and your own bank account. You do not wait around like a starving vulture for your mother to die, and you certainly do not try to shove me into a low-income state facility so your wife can play developer with my equity. You want property, Marcus. Go out into the world and buy some. But you will not be taking over this house. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked down at his lap, his face flushed with a deep, dark crimson of shame. He shrank back into his chair, completely emasculated by the undeniable truth of his own laziness. But Chloe did not feel shame. She felt pure, unadulterated rage. Her face turned an ugly, blotchy red, and the fake, sweet smile completely vanished, revealing the greedy, vicious woman beneath the designer clothes. She abruptly pushed her chair back from the table, the wooden legs scraping harshly against my polished floors. She grabbed her designer bag and the plastic tub of her untouched kale salad. You are making a massive mistake, Evelyn. She spat, her voice trembling with anger and entitlement. You are a selfish, stubborn old woman holding on to a decaying past. You cannot stop progress, and you certainly cannot stop us from getting what we deserve. She stormed toward the front door, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood. Marcus stood up, looking torn for a fraction of a second before making his choice. He always made the wrong choice. As he hurried down the hallway to follow her, Chloe leaned into his ear, and I heard her whisper a venomous, chilling promise. I told you she would not listen. We are doing this the hard way. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind them, rattling the antique picture frames in the hallway. I sat alone at my magnificent dining table, surrounded by the remnants of a family dinner that had just become the formal declaration of a war. I looked at the glossy brochure for Sunset Meadows and slowly, deliberately tore it into tiny, unrecognizable pieces. They thought they could bully me out of my legacy. They thought my calm refusal was the end of the conversation. They thought because I was an older woman, I would simply fold under the pressure of their modern corporate bullying. But as I sat there listening to the silence of my empty house, I knew that Chloe and Marcus were just getting started. I knew they would try to use the law. They would try to use my age, and they would try to use the money Marcus inherited from his father to break me. What they failed to realize was that I had spent my entire professional career writing the rules they thought they were playing by. I stood up from the table, began clearing the dishes, and started mapping out exactly how I was going to teach them a lesson they would never forget. It was the Wednesday following that disastrous Sunday dinner when the first real blow landed. The morning had started out beautifully. The sun was shining brightly through the stained glass windows of my living room, and I had spent the early hours tending to the rose bushes in my front yard. I felt a sense of peace settling over me, assuming that Marcus and Chloe had finally realized I was not going to budge. I thought their silence over the past few days meant they were retreating to lick their wounds and rethink their strategy. I was foolish to project my own sense of decency onto people who had clearly abandoned theirs. Around 10 in the morning, I washed my hands, grabbed my purse, and drove down to the local pharmacy. It was a routine errand. I needed to pick up my monthly prescription for my blood pressure medication. The pharmacy was located just a few blocks away in a small plaza I had frequented for over 20 years. The pharmacist there was a kind older gentleman named Arthur, who always asked about my garden and how my church community was doing. I walked in, greeted him warmly, and waited as he bagged my small white prescription bottle. The total came to $35, which was my standard copay. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out my primary bank platinum card. I have maintained an impeccable credit score my entire adult life. I have never missed a payment, never carried a balance I could not handle, and my pension from the city was more than enough to keep me perfectly comfortable. I swiped the card through the machine and waited for the familiar, approved beep. Instead, the machine let out a harsh, flat buzz. A small red message flashed across the digital screen saying transaction declined. I frowned, mildly confused. I told Arthur there must be some sort of chip reader error and asked him to run it again. He smiled politely and pressed a few buttons on his register, telling me that these new machines were always acting up. I wiped the gold chip on my sleeve and inserted the card a second time. We waited for a few agonizing seconds. The machine buzzed again. Declined. Please contact your banking institution. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up my neck. There was a young mother standing in line behind me, holding a crying toddler, and I could feel her eyes on my back. I apologized to Arthur, telling him I must have triggered a fraud alert by buying gardening supplies online the night before. I pulled out my backup credit card from a completely different bank and handed it to him. He swiped it. Declined. My heart skipped a strange, unnatural beat. 2 different cards from 2 different institutions. Declining within seconds of each other was not a coincidence, and it was certainly not a routine fraud alert. I excused myself, grabbing my purse and stepping out of the line so the young mother could pay. I walked over to the quiet aisle near the greeting cards, pulling my smartphone out of my purse with slightly trembling hands. I opened my primary banking application, expecting to see a quick notification asking me to verify a recent purchase. I typed in my password, and the screen loaded. What I saw made the breath completely vanish from my lungs. Across the top of my screen, in bold, glaring red letters, were the words, "Account frozen." I scrolled down frantically. My checking account, which held my monthly pension deposits, was locked. My savings account, which held the emergency funds my husband and I had built over 3 decades, was locked. Even the small joint account I used for charitable donations at the church had a padlock icon next to it. My available balance on every single screen read $0. A cold, heavy dread settled in the pit of my stomach. This was not a glitch. This was a targeted, deliberate financial execution Someone had completely severed my access to my own money. I did not panic. I closed the application, put my phone back into my purse, and walked out of the pharmacy without a word. I got into my car and locked the doors, sitting in the quiet interior for a long moment. I took 3 deep breaths, inhaling through my nose and exhaling through my mouth to steady my rising blood pressure. Then I put the car in drive and headed straight for the main downtown branch of my bank. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank with my head held high, projecting the absolute authority I had wielded for 30 years working for the city. I bypassed the teller line and walked directly toward the glass-walled office of the branch manager. His name was David. I had known David since he was a junior loan officer. He had helped my late husband and me set up our retirement portfolios. When David saw me approaching, his face went completely pale. He quickly stood up, pulling the blinds closed on his office windows before gesturing for me to sit down. "Evelyn," he said, his voice strained and uncomfortable. "I am so sorry. I tried to call you this morning, but the legal department told me I was not allowed to make contact until the court processed the paperwork." I sat down in the leather chair across from him, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I asked him to explain exactly what paperwork he was talking about and why my entire life savings had been paralyzed. David swallowed hard, looking down at a thick manila folder on his desk. He explained that yesterday afternoon, my son Marcus had walked into the bank with a lawyer. Marcus had presented a temporary medical power of attorney signed by a private physician. The document claimed that I was suffering from severe early-onset cognitive decline. It stated that I was experiencing paranoid delusions, memory loss, and severe financial confusion. Marcus claimed I was actively giving away my assets to scammers and that he needed to step in immediately to protect my estate. I sat there perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. My own son was trying to legally declare me incompetent. But I knew the law, and I knew that a simple doctor note was not enough to freeze millions of dollars in assets across multiple institutions without a formal court hearing. I looked David in the eye and asked him how Marcus managed to bypass the standard legal waiting period. David looked physically sick as he flipped to the second page in the folder. He explained that Marcus had dug up an old obscure clause from his late father's original life insurance trust. When my husband passed away 20 years ago, we had set up a protective family trust to ensure Marcus would be taken care of if anything ever happened to me. I had completely forgotten about the specific wording in the archaic document. Marcus and his high-priced lawyers had weaponized his father's love against me. They used that outdated trust clause, combined with the fake medical evaluation, to trigger an emergency asset freeze. They claimed I was a danger to myself and the estate. They had legally, financially suffocated me in a matter of 24 hours. Evelyn David whispered, looking at me with deep pity. "They are moving to place you under a full conservatorship. Marcus is petitioning the court to take total control of your health care, your living arrangements, and every single penny you own. Until the judge rules on the hearing, your accounts are legally bound. I cannot even authorize a withdrawal for your groceries." Most mothers would have broken down weeping in that chair. Most women would have felt their hearts shatter into a million pieces, realizing that the baby they birthed, the child they fed and clothed, had conspired to strip them of their human rights just to get his hands on a house. But as I sat there looking at the fake medical documents bearing my son's signature, I did not shed a single tear. The maternal warmth I had carried in my heart for Marcus for 35 years completely evaporated. It was replaced by a sharp, icy clarity. They wanted to play a legal game. They wanted to use the system to bully an old woman. They had no idea who they had just provoked. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of my skirt. I looked at David and thanked him for his honesty. I told him not to worry, and that this would all be sorted out very soon. I walked out of the bank with the same measured, dignified pace I had used to walk in. I got back into my car and locked the doors. The silence of the vehicle wrapped around me. I pulled my phone out of my purse and dialed a number I knew by heart. It was the private cell phone number of Sterling. Sterling was not just an old friend from my days working at City Hall. He was the most ruthless, brilliant defense attorney in the entire state. A man who had built his career tearing apart fraudulent corporations and corrupt politicians. The phone rang twice before his deep, gravelly voice answered. "Evelyn," he said, sounding pleasantly surprised. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this call?" I looked out the windshield at the bustling city streets I had spent my life helping to build. "Sterling," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "My son and his wife have just declared war. They forged a medical evaluation, froze my assets, and are attempting to put me under a conservatorship so they can steal my home." The line went dead silent for a moment as Sterling absorbed the information. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted from friendly to absolutely lethal. "Where are you right now?" he asked. "I am sitting in the bank parking lot," I replied. "Do not sign anything. Do not answer any phone calls from Marcus, and do not go back to your house just yet." Sterling instructed, his voice moving with rapid, tactical precision. "Come straight to my office, Evelyn. We are going to bury them." I told him I was on my way. I ended the call, put my phone away and started the engine. Marcus and Chloe had drawn the first blood, but they had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought cutting off my money would make me helpless. They forgot that my real power had never been in my bank account. It had always been in my mind. The drive back to my house was a blur of calculated thoughts. I needed to gather my original trust documents and my property deed before heading to see my attorney. As I pulled my car into my driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar grey sedan parked across the street. A man in a wrinkled beige suit stepped out and walked purposefully toward my front porch, just as I was unlocking my front door. He asked if I was Evelyn. I looked at him and told him I was. He handed me a thick, heavy manila envelope and told me I had been served before quickly turning around and walking back to his car. I walked inside my home, the very home my son was actively trying to steal from me, and sat down at the kitchen table. I opened the envelope and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents that were firmly stapled together. The heavy black letters at the top of the first page read, "Petition for appointment of conservator." My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon filling the pages. The petitioners were listed clearly as Marcus and Chloe. They were formally asking the state to grant them absolute control over my person and my entire estate. They were claiming under oath that I lacked the mental capacity to manage my own finances or make sound decisions about my health and general well-being. The sheer scope of what they were asking for was breathtaking. A conservatorship would not just give them control of my bank accounts. It would strip me of my right to vote, my right to drive a car, my right to choose my own doctors, and my right to live in my own home. They were asking a judge to legally reduce me to the status of a toddler so they could act as my guardians and liquidate my assets. I flipped to the exhibits section at the back of the thick packet. There it was, the supposed undeniable proof of my rapid mental decline. It was a formal medical evaluation printed on the letterhead of a private clinic I had never heard of, located in a rundown strip mall 2 towns over. The document was signed by a doctor whose name I did not recognize at all. The evaluation detailed a completely fabricated history of severe cognitive symptoms. It claimed I suffered from extreme memory lapses, that I was prone to aggressive, violent outbursts, and that I had been exhibiting dangerous financial irresponsibility by giving money to strangers. The diagnosis at the bottom of the page was printed in bold, dark letters stating I was suffering from early onset Alzheimer's disease and required immediate round-the-clock supervision in a managed care facility. When I thought about Marcus sitting in that shady clinic, handing over cash to a corrupt doctor to forge my diagnosis, a deep, profound sadness washed over me. Not for myself, but for the boy I had raised. I had poured every ounce of my love and resources into making sure he grew up with strong morals and a deep respect for his heritage. Yet here he was, willing to throw his own mother into a facility just to fund his wife's vanity projects. It was the ultimate betrayal of trust. The home they were trying to steal was not just real estate. It was a monument to African American resilience in a city that had constantly tried to push us out. My grandparents had faced discrimination, redlining, and unimaginable hardships to keep this property in our family. I was not going to let a spoiled child and his greedy wife erase that history for a quick profit. I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, running my fingers over the forged signature. Chloe had truly outdone herself this time. She had managed to find a crooked doctor willing to risk his medical license for a quiet cash payout, and Marcus had willingly signed his name to a massive lie that would strip his own mother of her basic human rights. They painted a picture of a frail, confused elderly woman wandering around a big, empty house, slowly losing her grip on reality. They thought a family court judge would look at this paperwork, see a grieving widow, and hand over my $1.5 million estate, without a second thought, just to clear the docket. I placed the documents neatly back into the manila envelope. I did not feel any fear, and I certainly did not feel confused. I felt the cold, sharp edge of absolute clarity cutting through any remaining maternal guilt I had left for my son. I gathered the rest of my important files from my home office, placed them into my leather briefcase, and walked back out to my car. It was time to go see Sterling. I drove downtown to the financial district, where the law firm of my old friend occupied the entire top floor of a towering glass skyscraper. The receptionist recognized me immediately and ushered me straight down the hallway into his private corner office. Sterling was pacing behind his massive oak desk, looking like a caged panther ready to strike. He had been my close friend and legal counsel for over 20 years, and he knew the sharpness of my mind better than anyone else in this city. I sat down in the plush leather chair opposite him and handed him the manila envelope containing the conservatorship petition. Sterling put on his reading glasses and began to scan the legal documents. As he read the fake medical evaluation, his jaw tightened visibly and his face flushed with deep anger. He slammed the paperwork down hard on his desk, describing the entire filing as a complete and utter joke. He told me that this supposed doctor had a well-documented history of malpractice suits, and that the clinic was a known pill mill operating on the edge of the law. Sterling was absolutely ready for war. He began pacing the room again, rattling off his aggressive legal strategy with rapid-fire precision. He said we would file an emergency motion to dismiss the very next morning to stop them in their tracks. We would demand an independent medical evaluation from a board-certified neurologist, which he knew I would pass with flying colors. Then he said we would relentlessly sue Marcus and Chloe for defamation fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He wanted to personally call the state medical board and have the crooked doctor stripped of his medical license before the week was over. He wanted to watch them burn for what they were trying to do to me. He finally stopped pacing and looked at me, expecting me to nod along and give him the green light to completely destroy them today. But I raised my hand slowly and simply told him no. Sterling stared at me in pure disbelief. He reminded me that my assets were completely frozen, and that if a judge granted this petition, Marcus and Chloe would have the legal authority to put me in a state-run nursing home and sell my ancestral house out from under me. He asked me why on earth we would wait when we had the power to crush their entire scheme right now. I leaned forward, resting my hands calmly on his polished desk, and looked him dead in the eye. I told him that if we stopped them right now, we would only be swatting them away like annoying flies. We would expose the fake medical report, and the judge would dismiss the case, but Marcus and Chloe would just retreat to their comfortable lives. They would play the victims, claim they were only acting out of deep concern for my declining health, and they would walk away without facing any real devastating consequences. They would just wait for me to actually get older and try the exact same scheme again. I told Sterling that I did not want to just win a simple court case and go back to normal. I wanted them to dig a hole so deep they could never possibly climb out. I explained my strategy to him in great detail. I told Sterling that I wanted to play the part of the confused, helpless old woman for just a little while longer. I wanted Marcus and Chloe to feel the intoxicating rush of victory. I wanted them to truly believe their master plan was working flawlessly, so they would get arrogant and reckless and take the next illegal step. People who are blinded by greed and entitlement always overreach when they think nobody is watching. If they thought I was completely neutralized and incapable of fighting back, they would start spending money they did not have and signing documents they had no legal right to sign. Sterling listened intently as I explained the generational importance of what was at stake. He knew my late husband, and he knew how hard we had worked. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, nodding in silent agreement. He understood that this was no longer just a legal battle over frozen funds. It was a matter of absolute respect and survival. He told me that he would assign his best private investigators to look into the clinic and the doctor who signed the forged evaluation. He wanted to know exactly how much Chloe paid for the fake diagnosis and if there was a paper trail we could use later. I told Sterling that Chloe was careless and arrogant, which meant she almost certainly left a trail of evidence behind. She thought she was untouchable because she had manipulated Marcus into doing her dirty work. But the law does not care about your ego. The law only cares about what you can prove in a court of record. And we were going to prove everything. Sterling slowly sat down in his heavy leather chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face as he finally understood the magnitude of what I was building. I instructed him to draft a secret counter-strategy that would remain completely off the radar. We would file a routine extension with the court to delay the conservatorship hearing, giving us a few crucial weeks of breathing room. During that time, I would lay low and let them think they had the upper hand in the situation. I told Sterling to prepare a devastating legal trap, meticulously gathering every single shred of evidence regarding their fraud, extortion, and elder abuse. We would not strike when they expected us to defend ourselves. We would strike when it would ruin them completely and permanently. Sterling agreed to the plan with a newfound sense of dark enthusiasm. He promised to quietly pull the financial records of Chloe's real estate business and track every single move Marcus made with my frozen bank accounts. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out every possible scenario and building an airtight case that would not just embarrass them, but would potentially send them to federal prison. As I left his office and rode the elevator back down to the lobby, I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. My own family had conspired to declare me legally incompetent, but they were about to learn a very hard lesson. A woman who spent 3 decades writing city legislation and outsmarting corporate developers was the absolute last person they should ever try to manipulate. It was Saturday evening, the night of the annual community church fundraising gala. For the past 15 years, I had proudly served on the board of elders for Mount Zion Fellowship. Our church was the cornerstone of the neighborhood, a place where generations of families came together to support one another through the hardest chapters of life. I had personally organized the gala this year, spending months securing donations to expand our youth mentorship program. The main fellowship hall was transformed with beautiful floral arrangements and soft, warm lighting. I was wearing my favorite emerald green silk dress, feeling a deep sense of quiet pride as I watched my community gather. I stood near the entrance, greeting families, accepting warm hugs from old friends, and laughing with the children. For a few hours, I let myself completely forget about the legal war my son was waging against me. Then the heavy wooden doors of the fellowship hall swung open, and the fragile peace of the evening was completely shattered. Marcus and Chloe walked in. They were not members of the church, and they had certainly not paid for a ticket to the gala. Chloe was wearing a simple faded beige dress that was completely out of character for her usual flashy designer wardrobe. She had minimal makeup on, and her hair was tied back in a loose, messy bun. She was clearly playing a calculated role. She had dressed up as the exhausted, selfless caretaker. Marcus walked beside her, looking appropriately solemn and burdened, dragging his feet as if the weight of the world was resting on his shoulders. I watched from across the room as they immediately bypassed the greeting line and headed straight for the tables where the oldest and most influential members of the congregation were seated. I did not approach them. I stayed by the refreshment table, pretending to adjust the floral centerpieces while keeping a close eye on their movements. Chloe was putting on an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. I watched her lean down to speak to Sister Margaret, one of the founding members of the church. Chloe placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh that could be heard 2 tables away. Even from a distance, I could see the fake tears welling up in Chloe's eyes. She pulled a crumpled tissue from her purse and dabbed at her face, playing the role of the tragic white savior who had sacrificed her own glamorous life to care for her poor black mother-in-law. A murmur began to ripple through the room. The warm, joyful atmosphere slowly shifted into one of hushed whispers and pitying glances directed at me. Later in the evening, during the open testimony portion of the gala, Pastor Williams opened the floor for members to speak about the blessings in their lives. Before anyone else could stand up, Chloe practically sprinted to the front of the room and grabbed the microphone from the stand. My stomach tightened into a hard knot, but I kept my face perfectly still. Chloe stood before my entire community, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed emotion. She introduced herself as my loving and devoted daughter-in-law. She told the congregation that she and Marcus had come tonight specifically to ask for their prayers. She said it was so incredibly difficult to watch a brilliant, vibrant woman like Evelyn slowly lose her mind to early-onset Alzheimer's disease. She spun a tragic, fabricated tale about how I was wandering around my large house late at night, forgetting my own name and leaving the stove on. She claimed that she and Marcus were bearing the immense emotional and financial burden of keeping me safe, and that it was breaking their hearts to see me deteriorate. She asked the church to pray for my mind and to please excuse my recent erratic behavior. She stood up there in front of the people I had worshipped with for decades and painted me as a helpless, mentally unstable burden. The congregation let out a collective gasp of sympathy. Several older women in the front row began to cry, openly dabbing their eyes and murmuring prayers for my healing. Chloe wiped away a final fake tear, handed the microphone back to the pastor, and walked back to her seat, keeping her head bowed in false humility. She had just publicly assassinated my character in front of my entire support system. She wanted to isolate me completely, making sure that when she and Marcus finally stole my home, everyone would simply believe they were doing it for my own good. As soon as the testimony portion concluded, I saw Pastor Williams gesture quietly for Marcus to join him in the hallway outside the main fellowship hall. A few moments later, one of the senior church ushers approached me. He gently touched my arm, whispering that the pastor and the board of elders needed to speak with me in private immediately. I smoothed down the fabric of my green silk dress, took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart, and followed the usher out of the hall. I knew exactly what was waiting for me in that room. I walked into the small administrative office behind the sanctuary. Pastor Williams was sitting behind his heavy wooden desk, looking deeply distressed and exhausted. Two of the senior elders, Deacon Hayes and Sister Margaret, were sitting beside him, looking at me with heartbreaking pity. Marcus stood in the far corner of the room, looking down at his expensive leather shoes, playing the role of the heartbroken son flawlessly. He had just finished feeding them whatever lies Chloe had scripted for him in the car ride over. Pastor Williams looked up at me with eyes full of genuine sorrow. "Evelyn," he said softly, his voice breaking slightly. "We have just been speaking with Marcus and Chloe. We had absolutely no idea you were struggling with such a heavy medical burden. You have always been so strong for all of us. Why did you not tell us that your health was failing?" I stood tall, pulling my shoulders back, and looked directly at my pastor. I told him my health was perfectly fine, and that my mind was as sharp today as it was 10 years ago. I calmly explained that what Marcus and his wife were doing was a calculated legal maneuver to steal my property and freeze my bank accounts. But as I spoke, I could see the thick cloud of doubt settling in the eyes of the elders. Marcus had already planted the poisonous seed. Chloe had watered it with her very public tears. The fake medical documents my son had undoubtedly shown them earlier had taken deep root in their minds. In their eyes, my calm denial was not the truth. It was just another tragic symptom of my supposed dementia. They thought I was in denial about my own sickness. Deacon Hayes leaned forward, resting his hands heavily on his knees. "Evelyn, we love you," he said gently, treating me like a fragile glass doll. "You have given so much of your life and your wisdom to this church. But the board simply cannot have a member who is undergoing such severe cognitive decline, making complex financial decisions for the congregation. We have a profound responsibility to protect the church funds, and you have a responsibility to focus entirely on your health. We think it is best if you step down from your leadership position, effective immediately." Pastor Williams nodded in solemn agreement, adding that they wanted me to take an indefinite leave of absence to rest and let my loving family care for me. They were truly trying to be kind, but their gentle words felt like a jagged knife twisting deep in my back. My own flesh and blood was standing right there in the corner, watching strangers strip me of my dignity based entirely on a fabricated medical report. Marcus did not say a single word to defend my honor. He just nodded sadly, confirming their worst fears to secure his inheritance. I could have fought them right then and there. I could have raised my voice, demanded a formal vote of the congregation, or called Sterling to threaten them with a defamation lawsuit, but I clearly remembered the strategy session in my lawyer's office. If I fought back aggressively, it would only validate Chloe's narrative that I was suffering from erratic, paranoid outbursts. If I wanted to win the absolute war, I had to be willing to lose this painful battle. I had to let them think they had completely broken my spirit. So I swallowed my immense pride. The metallic, bitter taste of betrayal sat heavy on my tongue, but I forced myself to nod gracefully. I looked at Pastor Williams and told him that I respected their decision as leaders of the church. I thanked the elders for their many years of partnership and told them I would step down from the board without causing any disruption to the community. I maintained my absolute dignity, refusing to give my son the satisfaction of seeing me shed a single tear in that office. I turned around and walked out of the administrative room back into the brightly lit hallway. Chloe was waiting just outside the door, leaning casually against the painted wall with her arms crossed over her chest. When she saw me step out, a slow, wicked, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She looked me up and down, her eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. She truly believed she had won the grand prize. She thought she had systematically dismantled my life, my finances, and my stellar reputation. She thought she had severed my deepest ties to my community, leaving me completely isolated, vulnerable, and powerless. I looked at her gloating smirk, and I did not react at all. I simply walked right past her out the heavy front doors of the church and into the cool, refreshing night air. Let her smile, I thought to myself as I walked across the parking lot to my car. Let her bask in the glorious illusion of her fake victory. She had just publicly tied herself to a massive, documented lie in front of 300 reliable witnesses. She thought she was expertly digging my grave, but she was actually just handing me the shovel to dig hers. I started my engine and drove home in the quiet darkness, knowing with absolute certainty that the time for playing the helpless victim was rapidly coming to an end. It was early Monday morning, the day after the humiliating spectacle at the church. I was sitting at my kitchen table holding a warm cup of black coffee and looking out the window at my front yard. The house was perfectly quiet. Marcus and Chloe thought they had successfully broken my spirit the night before. They thought I was sitting in the dark, weeping over my lost position on the church board. They had no idea I was simply waiting for their next move. I knew my daughter-in-law was impatient. I knew the taste of her fake victory at the church would make her arrogant and reckless. People like Chloe do not know how to play the long game. They want immediate gratification. My laptop chimed softly from the living room. I walked over and opened the screen. It was an automated email from the county property registry. During my 30 years working as the Director of Tax and Zoning, I had helped modernize the digital archives for the city. I had personally designed the security system that sent instant alerts to property owners whenever a new document was filed against their parcel number. It was a fail-safe meant to prevent title theft. Chloe was completely unaware that the very system she was trying to manipulate had been built by the woman she was trying to rob. I clicked on the secure link and downloaded the scanned document. It was a standard quitclaim deed. The bold letters at the top stated that the grantor was me and that I was transferring the absolute title and ownership of my ancestral home. The consideration amount listed was $0. According to this piece of paper, I was voluntarily giving away a property worth $1.5 million, completely for free. I scrolled down to look at the grantee section to see who was taking ownership of my legacy. It was not Marcus. It was a newly formed limited liability company. I opened a new tab on my browser and logged into the state business registry. It took me less than a minute to search the name of the company. The registered agent and sole proprietor of the business was listed as Chloe. She had cut my son completely out of the property title. Marcus had betrayed his own mother, frozen my bank accounts, and humiliated me in front of our entire community just to help his wife steal my house. And Chloe did not even have the basic decency to put his name on the stolen deed. She was planning to take the entire $1.5 million asset solely for herself. It was a breathtaking level of greed. I closed the browser and went back to the scanned deed, zooming in on the signature line at the bottom of the page. It was my name written in cursive black ink. To the untrained eye, it looked exactly like my handwriting. The loops and angles were nearly perfect. But I knew my own hand. The pressure of the pen was wrong and the spacing was slightly off. I sat back in my chair and thought about how she could have possibly gotten such a clean copy of my signature to trace. Then the memory hit me with sharp clarity. I remembered the Sunday dinner 1 month ago. I remembered Chloe storming down the hallway toward the front door. My home office is located right off that main hallway. The door had been open, and my desk was covered in tax documents I had been reviewing for the upcoming quarter. Chloe had been carrying a large, oversized designer bag. In the chaos of her dramatic exit, she had easily slipped into my office and stolen a stack of my signed paperwork. She took the documents home, studied my handwriting, and carefully traced my signature onto a fraudulent quitclaim deed. I stared at the screen, feeling a profound sense of cold calculation. This was no longer just a nasty family dispute. This was elder financial abuse. It was a deliberate, calculated act of real estate fraud. In the eyes of the federal government, stealing property from a senior citizen using forged documents is a felony that carries severe mandatory prison time. Chloe had just crossed an invisible line that she could never uncross. She had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her completely. But a quitclaim deed is not legally binding unless it is stamped and signed by a licensed notary public. I scrolled to the very bottom of the document to inspect the notary seal. The stamp belonged to a woman named Brenda, who operated out of a small, independent shipping and printing store on the east side of town. The east side was my old district. I knew every business owner on that side of the city. More importantly, my oldest friend Denise was the senior compliance officer for the state notary board. I closed my laptop, picked up my car keys, and drove straight to the state administration building downtown. I walked into the compliance office and found Denise sitting at her desk, surrounded by stacks of legal binders. Denise and I had started our careers in city government together over 3 decades ago. I handed her my phone with the digital copy of the forged deed displayed on the screen. I did not say a word. I just let her look at it. Denise adjusted her reading glasses and studied the document for a long time. She zoomed in on the signature and the notary stamp. She shook her head, her expression turning grim. She told me that Brenda, the notary who stamped this document, had been under investigation for months for taking cash bribes to rubber stamp real estate transfers without verifying identification. Denise looked at me and said the signature was a very good trace, but it was still a glaring forgery. She reached for her office phone, telling me she was going to call the district attorney right now to have the deed intercepted and have Chloe arrested for fraud. I reached out and gently pressed my hand down on the receiver, stopping her from making the call. Denise looked up at me, completely confused. I told her I did not want her to stop the deed from being processed. I told her I wanted her to let it go through the system exactly as it was. I wanted Chloe to be legally recorded as the absolute sole owner of my property. Denise stared at me as if I had lost my mind. She reminded me that if the county recorded this deed, I would legally lose all rights to my home. I smiled a cold, quiet smile and explained the reality of the situation to my dear friend. I told her that my property sat on a very specific parcel of land. Decades ago, long before my husband and I bought the house, the city had allowed an industrial dry cleaning company to operate on that exact lot. Deep beneath the foundation of my home were old, dormant chemical tanks buried in the soil. Because the house had been built before the new Environmental Protection Agency laws were enacted, the toxic soil was grandfathered in. As long as the foundation remained undisturbed, the property was perfectly safe and legal. But I knew exactly what Chloe was planning to do. She had bragged about it at the Sunday dinner. She was planning to bring in heavy machinery to gut the house, dig up the foundation, and build an underground parking garage for her luxury condos. The moment her contractors broke through that concrete basement floor, the Environmental Protection Agency would be instantly notified. The federal law is absolutely merciless when it comes to toxic soil disruption. The agency does not care who buried the chemicals. They only care who currently owns the dirt. The legal owner listed on the property deed is held entirely financially responsible for a mandatory hazardous waste cleanup. The cost of that specific cleanup was estimated at over $3 million. By forging this quitclaim deed, Chloe thought she was stealing a $1.5 million asset. But in reality, she was volunteering to take on a $3 million federal liability. If I stopped the forgery today, Chloe would just get a slap on the wrist for attempted fraud. Her high-priced lawyers would argue it was a misunderstanding, and she would go right back to her comfortable life. But if I let the deed become official, she would trigger a federal environmental disaster the second she started digging. She would bankrupt her company, bankrupt my son, and face federal prison time simultaneously. Denise listened to my explanation with her mouth slightly open. Slowly, a wide, brilliant smile spread across her face. She took her hand off the phone receiver and nodded. She logged into the county clerk portal from her computer and manually approved the transaction. With one click of a button, the quitclaim deed was officially recorded. Chloe was now the legal owner of my home, and all the toxic secrets buried beneath it. I thanked Denise, walked out of the administration building, and drove back to the house I legally no longer owned. The trap was now officially set, and all I had to do was step back and watch them dig their own graves. It was Tuesday afternoon when my smartphone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I was standing by the sink, washing a single coffee mug, and looking out at the old oak tree in my spacious backyard. The house felt entirely different now that I knew the forged deed had been officially recorded by the county clerk. It felt like a dark, empty stage set, waiting for the final, violent act of a tragic play to begin. I dried my hands slowly on a linen dish towel and picked up my phone. The digital screen was illuminated with a new text message notification from Marcus. I swiped to open the application and read the words my own flesh and blood had decided to send me. We own the house now. You have exactly 48 hours to move to the facility. We have already arranged for a medical transport van to pick you up on Thursday morning. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. I stared at the glowing screen for a very long time. There was no polite greeting. There was no explanation or attempt to soften the blow. There was not even an ounce of hesitation or guilt in his carefully chosen words. It was cold and clinical and utterly ruthless. I knew instantly that Chloe had dictated the entire message while Marcus simply pressed the send button. My son was an absolute coward who could not even look me in the eye to evict me from the home I had raised him in. He hid behind a text message, acting incredibly tough, because he believed the legal system was finally on his side. He truly believed he had outsmarted me, and that I was utterly defenseless against their combined cruelty. Most mothers would have called their son immediately screaming and crying and demanding an explanation for such a massive betrayal. Most women would have threatened to call the police or barricaded the heavy oak doors to protect their sanctuary, but I am not most women, and I do not react with predictable emotion. I sat down at the wooden kitchen table, resting the phone on the polished surface, and took a deep, steadying breath. I thought about the aggressive legal strategy Sterling and I had carefully mapped out in his downtown office. I needed Marcus and Chloe to feel completely secure in their fraudulent victory. I needed them to believe that their relentless bullying had successfully broken my spirit. If I fought back now over a simple text message, they might get spooked and slow down their illegal plans. I picked up the phone and began to type my response. I carefully crafted my words to sound exactly like a defeated, confused, and deeply frightened elderly woman. I wanted to give my daughter-in-law exactly the narrative she expected to see. I understand, Marcus. I will start packing my things right now. Please do not be angry with me anymore. I will be ready for the van when it arrives on Thursday. I hit send and placed the phone face down on the table. That simple, submissive text message was not a surrender. It was a perfectly executed legal trap. By replying meekly, I had just secured written, indisputable documentation of their extortion. Marcus had explicitly stated that they owned the house, and he gave me a strict deadline to vacate my primary residence under the threat of a forced medical facility transfer. This was textbook elder abuse and an entirely illegal eviction process. They had not served me with proper legal eviction notices through the courts because they did not want to create a public paper trail. They thought they could just intimidate an old woman into leaving quietly in the middle of the night. But now I had their illegal threats recorded in black and white, digitally time-stamped and automatically backed up to my secure cloud storage. Sterling was going to use this single text message to absolutely destroy their credibility in front of a federal judge. I walked slowly through the quiet rooms of my house, absorbing the beautiful memories embedded deep within the walls. I ran my hand along the back of the velvet sofa in the living room and straightened the framed family photographs on the brick mantel. This house was a proud monument to the resilience of my family. My grandparents had fought tooth and nail against a racist system to secure this property, and I had spent 30 years carefully maintaining it. Letting my greedy daughter-in-law and my spineless son take possession of it even for a short time felt like a deep, painful betrayal of my ancestors. But I knew this temporary tactical retreat was entirely necessary. In order to win a war of this magnitude, you sometimes have to let the enemy occupy the battlefield so they can confidently trigger the landmines you buried beneath the dirt. I knew I only had 48 hours before Chloe and Marcus arrived to claim their stolen prize. But I was not about to leave my ancestral home completely unprotected and unmonitored. During my long tenure as the Director of Tax and Zoning, I had worked closely with various independent security contractors across the city. I knew exactly who to call when I needed something done, quietly, efficiently, and strictly off the official books. I pulled out my laptop and sent a highly encrypted email to a private security firm owned by a former police detective who owed me a significant personal favor. Within 2 hours, an unmarked white van pulled into my long driveway. 3 technicians, dressed in plain casual clothes, stepped out carrying heavy black equipment cases. I let them through the back kitchen door and gave them very specific, uncompromising instructions. I wanted high-definition, motion-activated cameras installed in every single room of the house. I needed crystal-clear audio recording capabilities, and I needed the entire surveillance system to be completely invisible to the naked eye. The technicians nodded and went to work immediately, moving through my home with practiced silent precision. They replaced the standard smoke detectors in the hallways with identical units that housed tiny, wide-angle lenses. They installed microscopic cameras inside the metal air vents in the living room and the kitchen. They even managed to wire a highly sensitive hidden microphone behind the antique wall clock in the dining room, where the infamous Sunday dinner had taken place. Every single angle of the house was perfectly covered. Nobody could walk through a door or whisper a single secret word without it being captured in high definition and instantly uploaded to a secure remote private server. While the private security team worked, I walked into my spacious master bedroom and began to pack. I did not pack a lifetime of accumulated belongings. I only took what was absolutely necessary for my survival and comfort. I packed 2 large suitcases with my favorite clothes, my essential daily toiletries, and my most important personal financial documents. I left everything else exactly as it was. I left my heavy wooden jewelry box sitting on the dresser, my expensive winter coats hanging in the closet, and my fine china stacked neatly in the kitchen cabinets. I wanted Chloe to walk in and see all the beautiful, luxurious things she thought she had successfully stolen. I wanted her incredible greed to blind her completely to the reality of the federal trap. Once the technicians finished their meticulous work and handed me the digital access credentials, they packed up their heavy tools and quietly slipped out the back door. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. There was absolutely no trace of the sophisticated surveillance network pulsing quietly within the plaster walls. I grabbed my 2 suitcases, took one last long look around my beautiful home, and locked the heavy oak front door behind me. I certainly did not go to the depressing, low-income assisted living facility Chloe had selected for me. I drove my car straight to the downtown financial district and pulled into the secure underground parking garage of a 5-star luxury extended stay hotel. Over the past 5 years, I had slowly withdrawn large amounts of cash from my various accounts to keep in a secure safety deposit box for extreme unpredictable emergencies. Marcus might have legally frozen my digital bank accounts, but he had absolutely no idea about the thick envelopes of untraceable cash I had stored away for a rainy day. I walked up to the polished marble concierge desk and paid for a massive penthouse suite for an entire month entirely in crisp $100 bills. The luxury suite was breathtaking. It featured floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the glittering city skyline, a full modern kitchen with stainless steel appliances, and a massive, deep-soaking tub in the master bathroom. It was a very far cry from the bleak, state-funded facility my son thought I was currently weeping inside. I unpacked my clothes, hung my soft silk robes in the spacious walk-in closet, and made myself a fresh cup of warm chamomile tea. I walked over to the plush velvet sofa in the center of the living room and opened my laptop. I entered the complex alphanumeric password the security technicians had provided and hit the enter key. The screen flickered black for a brief second, before instantly splitting into a grid of 12 different high-definition video feeds. I was looking directly into the silent heart of my own home. The picture was incredibly clear, and the sensitive audio feed picked up the gentle, familiar hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I leaned back heavily against the soft cushions, taking a slow, satisfying sip of my tea. The trap was now fully operational and completely armed. My assets were legally frozen. My home was officially deeded to a fraudulent limited liability company, and I was a silent ghost watching everything unfold from a luxury tower in the sky. Marcus and Chloe thought they had successfully erased me from the picture. They thought they were about to walk into an empty, unprotected house and begin building their massive real estate empire. They had absolutely no idea they were stepping onto a stage perfectly lit and wired to broadcast every single one of their incoming federal crimes. I smiled a cold, hard smile at the glowing laptop screen, completely ready to watch the greatest show of their miserable lives begin. It was early Wednesday morning, and the sun was just beginning to cast a golden glow across the city skyline outside my penthouse window. I was sitting at the glass dining table in my plush hotel suite, wearing a soft cashmere sweater and holding a warm cup of herbal tea. My laptop was open in front of me, displaying the 12 hidden camera feeds broadcasting from my supposedly empty home. I had not slept much the night before, but I did not feel tired. I felt completely alert and sharply focused. Marcus had given me 48 hours to vacate the premises, but I knew my daughter-in-law simply lacked the patience to wait that long. She was eager to claim her stolen prize. Right on cue at 8 in the morning, a large black luxury SUV pulled into my driveway. The high-definition camera mounted inside the living room air vent provided a perfect view of the heavy oak front door. A key turned in the lock. Marcus must have secretly made a copy of my house key months ago during one of his brief, obligatory Sunday visits. The door swung open and Chloe walked in, acting as if she were a conquering queen entering a defeated territory. Marcus trailed closely behind her, looking nervous and keeping his eyes glued to his phone screen. The audio feed crackled to life, picking up Chloe's voice with crystal-clear precision. She stood in the center of my beautiful foyer, placed her hands on her hips, and loudly declared that the entire house smelled like mothballs and regret. I watched as she dropped a heavy roll of industrial black garbage bags onto my pristine hardwood floor. She did not even take off her designer shoes, tracking street dirt across the rugs I had meticulously vacuumed just 2 days prior. Chloe immediately went to work systematically dismantling the history of my family. She unrolled a black trash bag and walked straight into the living room. She marched over to the antique wooden credenza and began sweeping her arm across the top, pushing my framed family photographs directly into the garbage. I watched through the screen as the glass frames shattered against the floor. Pictures of my late husband, pictures of my parents, and even pictures of Marcus as a young boy were tossed away like meaningless clutter. She then moved to the walls. Hanging above the fireplace was a beautiful hand-carved wooden mask my grandfather had brought back from a trip to Ghana. It It was a piece of profound cultural significance that had been passed down through 3 generations. Chloe grabbed it, pulled it off the wall and tossed it into the bag, casually remarking to Marcus that the house was full of outdated, depressing junk. She said they needed a completely blank slate to attract high-end modern buyers for their luxury condos. I watched Marcus standing in the doorway of the living room. My son, the boy I had carried and nurtured and protected, watched his wife desecrate the memory of his own father and his ancestors. He flinched when the wooden mask hit the bottom of the trash bag. But he did not say a single word. He did not step forward to defend our family history. He simply shoved his hands into his pockets and looked away. In that exact moment, the very last tiny fraction of maternal sympathy I held for him completely evaporated. He was no longer a victim of his wife's manipulation. He was an active, willing participant in the destruction of his own legacy. Chloe dragged the heavy bag of my precious belongings to the front door and dropped it without a second thought. She clapped her hands together, wiping off the invisible dust, and told Marcus to go wait outside for the contractor. She was completely intoxicated by her own perceived power. She truly believed she had evicted a helpless old woman and conquered an empire. She had absolutely no idea that she was performing her wicked little victory dance directly inside the jaws of a massive federal trap. About 20 minutes later, a loud, heavy diesel truck pulled up onto my front lawn, completely ignoring the paved driveway. The camera feed by the front door showed a large, burly man stepping out of the truck. He was wearing heavy work boots, faded jeans, and a high-visibility yellow vest over a stained shirt. This was Todd. Chloe had mentioned his name during the chaotic morning they tried to break my door down, but seeing him now confirmed everything I suspected. He did not look like a licensed, reputable builder. He looked exactly like a cheap, unlicensed contractor who made his living cutting corners and ignoring city ordinances. Todd walked through my front door without wiping his boots, leaving thick, muddy footprints across the foyer. Chloe greeted him with an overly enthusiastic smile, immediately launching into her grand vision for the property. She gestured wildly around my living room, telling Todd that she wanted all the interior walls gutted by the end of the week. She spoke rapidly, outlining a plan to tear down the historic brick exterior and replace it with cheap modern glass and steel. Todd crossed his arms and looked around the room, chewing on a piece of gum. He bluntly told Chloe that the interior demolition was the easy part. He asked her to show him the foundation, because if she wanted to turn a single-family home into a 3-unit luxury condominium complex, they were going to have a massive parking problem. The property simply did not have the street clearance to support multiple vehicles. Chloe smiled a sly, greedy smile and told Todd she already had a brilliant solution. She motioned for him to follow her toward the back hallway. I quickly moved my computer mouse and switched the primary video feed on my laptop to the camera hidden inside the basement stairwell. The basement was a large, unfinished space with a solid poured concrete floor that had sat completely undisturbed for over 50 years. Chloe and Todd walked down the wooden stairs and stood in the center of the damp, quiet room. Chloe spread her arms wide and told Todd they were going to dig down. She explained her master plan to completely excavate the basement smash through the original concrete floor and dig a massive subterranean parking garage. She proudly claimed that an underground garage would double the market value of the luxury condos, giving them a massive return on their investment. Todd kicked at the solid concrete floor with the toe of his heavy steel boot. He shook his head and told Chloe that digging out a foundation in this specific historic zoning district would be a complete nightmare. He explained that submitting the architectural plans to the city zoning board would take at least 6 months of public hearings. He warned her that the city inspectors would be swarming the property, checking for soil stability and structural permits before they could even bring a single machine onto the lot. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, holding my breath and waiting for her response. This was the critical juncture. Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, arrogant laugh. She stepped closer to Todd and lowered her voice slightly, though the sensitive microphone picked up every single treacherous word. She told Todd they were not going to pull any permits, and they were certainly not going to wait 6 months for the city to give them permission to build on their own land. She bragged that she held the absolute legal deed to the property, and she could do whatever she pleased. She instructed Todd to bring a compact, heavy excavator through the back alleyway over the weekend when the city administrative offices were closed. She told him to smash through the concrete floor and start digging the deep foundation immediately. She confidently promised him a massive cash bonus if he could get the dirt removed and the new retaining walls poured before the neighborhood association even noticed what was happening. She completely dismissed his concerns, stating that once the hole was dug, the city would just issue a retroactive fine, which she would easily pay out of their massive future profits. Todd paused for a moment, rubbing his bearded chin as he calculated the risk versus the reward. Greed is a highly infectious disease, and Chloe was an absolute carrier. Todd finally nodded his head and agreed to the illegal plan. He told her he would have his crew and the heavy digging equipment on site first thing Friday morning. They shook hands, sealing their disastrous illicit partnership right over the exact spot where the toxic chemicals were buried. I sat back in my plush velvet chair inside my luxury hotel suite, and a slow, chilling smile formed on my face. The sheer magnitude of their arrogant stupidity was almost beautiful to witness. Chloe thought she was outsmarting the local zoning board by skipping the permit process. She did not realize that the local city inspectors were the absolute least of her problems. By illegally ordering an unlicensed contractor to smash through a grandfathered concrete foundation, she was about to awaken a dormant nightmare. She was about to release toxic industrial fumes directly into the air and trigger a mandatory federal response from the Environmental Protection Agency. And because her forged quitclaim deed had successfully transferred the property into her newly formed company, she was the sole legal owner on record. She was completely liable. I picked up my teacup and took a slow, satisfying sip. The tea tasted incredibly sweet. Chloe and Marcus had brought garbage bags to throw away my past, but they had just signed a contract to completely obliterate their own future. All I had to do now was wait for the heavy machinery to arrive and watch them eagerly dig a hole they would never, ever escape. I sat back in my plush velvet chair inside my luxury hotel suite and closed my laptop for a moment. The glowing grid of security camera feeds faded to black, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the quiet hum of the city traffic far below. Seeing Todd, the unlicensed contractor, standing in my basement and agreeing to bring heavy machinery to my home should have terrified me. It should have sent me into a frantic panic. But instead, I felt a profound sense of absolute peace. To understand the true depth of the trap I had laid for my greedy daughter-in-law, you have to understand the specific history of the land my house was built on. During my 30 years working as the Director of Tax and Zoning, I did not just push paper across a desk. I studied the deep, complex geological and commercial history of every single neighborhood in the city. I knew the secrets buried beneath the pavement that most modern real estate developers completely ignored. Long before my late husband and I purchased our beautiful home back in the late 1960s, the property was not a residential lot at all. It was a bustling commercial district, and sitting exactly on our parcel of land was a massive industrial dry cleaning facility. In those days, business owners did not have strict environmental regulations to follow. When they needed to store highly toxic dry cleaning solvents, like perchloroethylene and trichloroethylene, they simply buried massive, heavy steel storage tanks deep underground. When the dry cleaning business eventually went bankrupt and the building was torn down, those massive chemical tanks were never removed. The developers who bought the land simply paved over them poured a thick, solid concrete foundation, and built residential homes right on top of the dormant toxic hazard. When my husband and I bought the house decades later, the city zoning office made us fully aware of the dormant tanks. But they also assured us that we were completely safe. I reached for my phone on the glass table and dialed Sterling's private number. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and ready for battle. He told me he was finalizing the legal paperwork to formally contest the fake medical conservatorship Marcus had filed. He wanted to know if I was ready to serve them with the injunction and freeze their newly formed limited liability company. I told Sterling to put down his pen and listen to me very carefully. I explained that I had been watching my hidden security cameras all morning. I told him about the large garbage bags filled with my family memories, and about Todd, the aggressive, unlicensed contractor who had walked through my home, leaving muddy footprints on my hardwood floors. I told Sterling that Chloe had explicitly instructed Todd to bring a heavy excavator to the house on Friday morning to smash through the concrete basement floor and dig a massive underground parking garage for her imaginary luxury condos. Sterling was silent for a long moment before letting out a heavy sigh of frustration. He warned me that if they actually broke ground and started demolishing the foundation, the structural integrity of the historic home would be completely compromised. He urged me to let him call the city building inspector immediately to issue a stop work order before Todd could do any permanent physical damage to my property. He said we had enough evidence of their fraud to put them in jail right now, and we did not need to risk the house. I smiled a calm, knowing smile, and told my old friend that he was thinking like a traditional defense attorney when he needed to be thinking like a city planner. I finally revealed my absolute trump card. I told Sterling about the massive industrial dry cleaning tanks buried directly beneath the concrete floor of my basement. I carefully explained the specific federal mandates of the Environmental Protection Agency to Sterling. The federal law dictates a very clear grandfather clause for properties built over old toxic waste sites. As long as the heavy concrete foundation remains completely undisturbed, the chemical tanks are considered permanently sealed and safely contained. The property is perfectly legal to inhabit, and the city zoning board considers it a closed matter. The toxic soil is allowed to sleep in the dark, and the homeowners are protected from liability. But I told Sterling the exact moment someone takes a sledgehammer or an excavator to that solid concrete seal, everything completely changes. The absolute second the concrete is cracked and the contaminated soil is exposed to the open air, the grandfather clause is instantly permanently voided. The local city building inspectors do not handle the situation anymore. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency immediately steps in with absolute uncompromising authority. The federal environmental law is notoriously merciless. The agency does not care who buried the chemical tanks 50 years ago. They do not care about the original dry cleaning company, and they certainly do not care about the previous homeowners. The law states explicitly that the current legal owner listed on the property deed at the exact moment the soil is disturbed is held entirely financially liable for a mandatory complete hazardous waste cleanup. I heard Sterling take a sharp intake of breath over the phone as the magnificent reality of the situation finally dawned on him. I continued my explanation, my voice perfectly steady and cold. I reminded him that Chloe was far too arrogant and greedy to put my son on the new property title. She wanted the entire $1.5 million asset completely for herself. So she forged my signature on a quitclaim deed, transferring the absolute ownership of my home to her newly formed limited liability company. She proudly marched into the county clerk office and legally recorded the fraudulent document. I told Sterling that by legally stealing my house, Chloe had officially unknowingly assumed all federal liability for the land beneath it. When Todd, the unlicensed contractor, drives his excavator through my basement floor on Friday morning, He will release highly toxic chemical fumes directly into the neighborhood. The Environmental Protection Agency will swarm the property within hours. They will shut down the entire street, set up massive quarantine tents, and condemn the building. And when they look up the county property records to see who is responsible for the massive environmental disaster, they will not find my name. They will find Chloe's name and the name of her brand new company. Sterling let out a low, rich chuckle that slowly grew into a full, booming laugh, echoing through the phone speaker. He called the plan absolute poetic justice. He asked me if I knew exactly how much a full federal toxic soil excavation and chemical cleanup would cost in that specific historical residential zone. I told him I knew the exact number, because I had run the environmental impact estimates myself during my final year as the city zoning director. The mandatory hazardous waste cleanup procedure requires specialized hazmat teams, massive soil replacement, and years of mandatory groundwater testing. The absolute minimum cost for the federal cleanup is $3 million. And because the Environmental Protection Agency acts with federal authority, that debt cannot simply be erased by filing for standard corporate bankruptcy. The government will pierce the corporate veil of her limited liability company and go directly after all of her personal assets. They will garnish her wages, seize her bank accounts, and liquidate anything of value she or my son currently own to pay for the cleanup. Chloe thought she was executing a brilliant, ruthless business maneuver. She thought she was stealing generational wealth from a helpless, confused, elderly woman. She looked at my home and saw nothing but pure profit and luxury condos. But because she let her profound arrogance blind her, she never bothered to do a simple environmental land survey. She never bothered to research the history of the neighborhood she was so desperate to gentrify. She had forged federal documents and committed elder abuse just to steal a $3 million toxic debt. I told Sterling to keep his legal documents ready, but to stay completely silent until Friday. We were not going to stop them from digging. We were going to sit back and watch them gleefully open a poisonous nightmare of their own making. I ended the call with Sterling and opened my laptop once again. The camera feeds flickered back onto the screen, showing my empty, violated house. The garbage bags full of my memories were still sitting by the front door. But I was no longer angry. I just felt a deep, cold anticipation, watching the digital clock on my computer screen slowly tick toward Friday morning. By Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in my hotel suite, reviewing the latest financial intelligence Sterling had sent over. My lawyer had kept his promise and deployed his absolute best private investigators to track every single financial move my daughter-in-law was making. What they uncovered was a financial suicide mission so incredibly reckless, it almost left me speechless. Chloe had realized very quickly that hiring an unlicensed contractor like Todd to dig a massive underground parking garage was going to require an enormous amount of upfront liquid cash. Todd did not work on credit, and he certainly did not accept standard bank checks that could be traced by the IRS or the state tax board. He wanted cold, hard, untraceable cash to pay his off-the-books crew and to rent the heavy machinery required for an illegal excavation. Traditional banking institutions require architectural blueprints, approved city permits, and extensive environmental soil surveys before they will even consider lending money for a commercial property flip. Chloe knew perfectly well she did not have any of those things. So blinded by her own incredible greed and desperate to fast-track her imaginary luxury empire, she bypassed the traditional banking system entirely and went looking for fast, dangerous money. She walked right into the sleek downtown office of a notorious hard money lending firm. Hard money lenders are essentially high-class loan sharks who cater specifically to desperate real estate developers. They do not care about your personal credit score or your long-term business plan. They only care about the hard collateral you are willing to put on the table, and they charge incredibly predatory interest rates that compound monthly. Sterling forwarded me the digital copy of the loan agreement his investigator had managed to quietly pull from the county records. Chloe had taken out a massive $2 million loan with an absolutely staggering 25% interest rate. She had legally pledged her newly formed limited liability company as the primary collateral for the massive debt. That company held the forged quitclaim deed to my ancestral home, meaning she had literally bet my house on this completely illegal project. But $2 million is a massive amount of high-risk capital, and the predatory lender demanded even more security before they would release the funds. That is the exact moment Marcus stepped in and committed the ultimate unforgivable betrayal against his own late father. When my husband passed away 2 decades ago, he left Marcus a substantial inheritance locked safely inside a family trust. It was meant to secure my son's future, to pay for his future children to go college, and to keep him safe if he ever fell on hard times. Marcus took that sacred money, the very same money he had used as leverage, to freeze my own bank accounts, and legally pledged every single penny of it as secondary collateral for his wife's predatory loan. He willingly signed away his father's lifelong legacy just to feed Chloe's delusions of grandeur. I looked at their digital signatures at the bottom of the loan document. They had completely locked themselves into a financial death spiral from which there was zero escape. If this development project failed, they would not just lose my house. The hard money lenders would legally seize the limited liability company, completely wipe out Marcus' entire inheritance, and leave them both with millions of dollars in insurmountable personal debt. They had strapped themselves to a massive financial bomb, and all they needed now was a match to light the fuse. That match arrived exactly at 7 o'clock on Friday morning. I was already awake, sitting at my laptop with a fresh cup of dark roast coffee resting on the table. The 12 hidden security camera feeds were brightly lit on my screen, showing the early morning sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of my home. Suddenly, the quiet audio feed was completely shattered by the deafening, violent roar of a massive diesel engine. Todd had kept his corrupt promise to my daughter-in-law. I watched through the outdoor security camera as a massive, heavy-duty flatbed truck completely tore up my pristine front lawn. They were not even trying to be careful or discreet. The truck backed right up to the side of the historic house, crushing my beautiful blooming rose bushes beneath its massive, heavy tires. 2 men jumped out of the cab and began unchaining a compact but incredibly powerful industrial excavator. I switched my primary viewing window to the hidden camera mounted securely inside the basement stairwell. Todd walked down the wooden stairs wearing a yellow hard hat and carrying a thick clipboard. He aggressively directed his men to completely knock down the wide wooden cellar doors to make enough room to drive the excavator directly into the enclosed basement. I watched the heavy metal tracks of the machine crush the historic wooden doorframe as it rolled heavily into the damp, quiet space. Todd pointed directly to the center of the solid, poured concrete floor. He gave a sharp hand signal, and the operator raised the massive hydraulic arm of the excavator. The heavy steel jackhammer attachment that came crashing down onto the thick concrete with a violent earth-shattering blow. The entire house shuddered, and the camera feed vibrated violently from the sheer physical force of the impact. They struck the floor again and again. With every brutal pounding blow, the solid concrete foundation that had safely sealed the toxic history of the land for over 50 years began to splinter and deeply crack. I leaned closer to my glowing laptop screen, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm of pure, cold anticipation. I watched as a massive chunk of the heavy concrete floor finally gave way, completely collapsing downward into the dark earth below. The chemical reaction was almost instantaneous. Even though I was miles away, safely tucked inside a luxury hotel suite, I could see exactly what was happening. A thick, strange yellowish vapor began to rapidly seep up from the freshly exposed soil. It was the dormant, highly toxic perchloroethylene gas rising from the crushed industrial dry cleaning tanks buried deep beneath the dirt. The heavy, poisonous gas billowed out, filling the enclosed basement space with terrifying speed. The hidden camera audio picked up the immediate sounds of violent, uncontrollable coughing. The excavator operator quickly killed the diesel engine and threw open the glass door of the cab, desperately covering his mouth and nose with his thick work shirt. Todd took 3 rapid steps back, violently waving his hands in front of his face as the highly concentrated toxic fumes actively burned his eyes and lungs. He started screaming frantically at his men to get out of the basement immediately. They stumbled blindly up the wooden stairs, gasping desperately for clean air, leaving the massive, heavy machine sitting directly over the open toxic wound they had just carved into the earth. The protective grandfather clause was officially broken. The concrete seal was permanently destroyed. My property was now an active, catastrophic federal environmental hazard. I did not hesitate for a single second. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the emergency reporting hotline for the State Environmental Protection Board. The call was routed directly to the Hazardous Materials Response Unit. A woman answered the phone immediately, asking for the exact nature of the emergency. I kept my voice incredibly calm, carefully disguising it to sound like a frightened, innocent neighbor walking their dog down the street. I gave the emergency dispatcher the exact street address of my home. I told her that an unlicensed construction crew had just shattered a historic concrete foundation and that thick chemical fumes smelling heavily like industrial dry cleaning solvents were rapidly pouring out of the basement and spreading directly into the residential neighborhood. The dispatcher immediately elevated the call to a Tier 1 federal emergency. She told me to stay far away from the property and assured me that federal hazmat response teams were being dispatched immediately. I thanked her politely and ended the call. I set my phone down gently on the glass table and looked back at my laptop screen. The basement was now completely clouded with the thick, toxic, yellowish vapor. Chloe had desperately wanted to dig a hole to build her real estate empire. She had taken out a predatory $2 million loan to pay for the ultimate privilege of destroying my historic home. And in doing so, she had just triggered a mandatory $3 million federal chemical cleanup that she was now legally and entirely responsible for. The trap had officially and violently snapped shut, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop the devastating fallout. I sat completely still in the quiet luxury of my hotel suite, my eyes locked onto the glowing screen of my laptop. The 12 security camera feeds were broadcasting the absolute chaos unfolding at my ancestral home. Down in the basement, the thick, yellowish vapor continued to billow from the violently shattered concrete floor, filling the enclosed space with a highly toxic fog. Outside, on the crushed grass of my front lawn, Todd and his unlicensed crew were hunched over, coughing violently and wiping their burning eyes with their dirty work shirts. They had no idea what they had just unleashed, but they knew it was dangerous. Todd was frantically dialing his cell phone, pacing back and forth across the driveway, likely trying to get a hold of Chloe to tell her the excavation was a complete disaster. But Todd did not even have the chance to finish his panicked phone call. Less than 15 minutes after I had placed my anonymous report to the State Environmental Board, the distant wail of emergency sirens began to echo through the quiet residential neighborhood. The sound grew louder and more piercing with every passing second until it became a deafening mechanical scream. Through the exterior camera feed, I watched as 2 massive red fire trucks turned the corner and aggressively blocked off both ends of my street. They were immediately followed by half a dozen local police cruisers, with their blue and red lights flashing wildly, casting harsh, frantic shadows against the historic brick exterior of my home. Neighbors began stepping out onto their front porches, pulling their robes tight around their shoulders, pointing and whispering as the massive emergency response completely overtook the block. Then came the unmarked federal vehicles. Three heavy black tactical vans with dark tinted windows rolled to a stop directly in front of my driveway. The doors slid open and a specialized hazardous materials response team stepped out. They were moving with incredible military precision, completely covered from head to toe in bright yellow chemical containment suits, carrying heavy oxygen tanks on their backs and holding complex digital air quality monitors. Todd took one look at the federal hazmat team and absolutely panicked. He dropped his clipboard onto the grass, turned around and tried to make a run for his heavy diesel truck. But the local police were already moving. Three officers sprinted across the lawn, tackling the burly contractor directly onto the muddy ground right next to my crushed rose bushes. They pulled his hands aggressively behind his back and secured them with heavy metal handcuffs. Todd was screaming that he was just a hired contractor and that he did not know anything about buried chemicals, but the police officers simply dragged him to the back of a cruiser and shoved him inside. His unlicensed illegal excavation days were officially over. The hazmat team wasted no time. They quickly unrolled massive spools of thick yellow caution tape, completely wrapping the perimeter of the property and physically pushing the curious neighbors back toward the end of the block. Two men in full yellow containment suits walked cautiously through the splintered front door, holding their air monitors in front of them like digital weapons. The devices immediately began blaring a rapid, high-pitched warning alarm, detecting the lethal concentration of perchloroethylene gas rising from the basement stairwell. The team leader gave a sharp hand signal, instructing his men to fall back immediately. The air was entirely too toxic to breathe, even with standard filtration masks. I watched through the front porch camera as a senior city zoning official stepped out of a white municipal car. He was wearing a dark windbreaker and carrying a large, heavy-duty staple gun. He walked directly up to my beautiful, heavy oak front door, the door that had protected my family for over 80 years. He pulled a massive, bright neon red poster from his clipboard. The bold, black letters printed across the top were large enough to read from the street. Condemned state property. Toxic hazard. Stop work order. He held the poster against the shattered wood and fired the staple gun 3 times, echoing with a loud, harsh finality. My home was officially seized by the government. Nobody could enter, nobody could exit, and absolutely no construction could take place. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow for the temporary state of my beautiful house and profound, cold satisfaction. The trap had worked flawlessly. The bait had been taken, and the jaws of the federal government had just snapped shut around the property. Just as the hazmat crew began setting up a massive white decontamination tent on my front lawn, a sleek black luxury SUV came speeding recklessly down the street. It screeched to a halt just inches away from the police barricade. The driver's side door flew open and Chloe stepped out. She was wearing a crisp white designer pantsuit and holding her expensive leather handbag, looking completely out of place amidst the flashing emergency lights and yellow containment suits. Marcus scrambled out of the passenger side, looking absolutely terrified. His eyes darting frantically from the handcuffed contractor in the police car to the massive red condemned sticker stapled to the front door. Chloe marched directly up to the police tape, completely ignoring the severe danger of the situation. She started screaming at the nearest police officer, demanding to know what was going on. She aggressively pointed a manicured finger at my house, shouting that she was the legal owner of the property and that they had absolutely no right to trespass on her active construction site. The police officer simply held his hand up, stepping back and refusing to engage with her hysterical tantrum. Instead, he unclipped a radio from his belt and spoke a few quiet words into the receiver. A moment later, a tall, older man stepped out from behind the command center van. He was not wearing a police uniform or a hazmat suit. He was wearing a sharp, tailored grey suit and a silver badge pinned directly to his lapel. This was the regional director of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, and he looked like a man who had zero tolerance for arrogant real estate developers. He walked over to the police barricade, holding a thick, heavy clipboard, and looked down at Chloe with an expression of absolute cold, professional disdain. He asked her if she was Chloe, the registered agent and sole owner of the limited liability company currently listed on the property deed. Chloe puffed up her chest, throwing her shoulders back and lifting her chin with incredible arrogance. She proudly confirmed that she was the absolute sole owner. She aggressively demanded that the director order his men off her property immediately so her contractor could finish digging her underground parking garage. She threatened to call her high-priced lawyers and sue the entire city for delaying her luxury condominium project. The federal director did not blink. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. He simply unclipped a thick stack of formal legal documents from his clipboard and handed them directly to Chloe. He told her that her contractor had just illegally smashed through a grandfathered concrete foundation without a single city permit. He explained that in doing so, they had ruptured massive industrial dry cleaning tanks buried deep in the soil, releasing highly toxic perchloroethylene gas into a dense residential neighborhood. He stated with absolute cold authority that the federal government was immediately seizing control of the land to initiate a mandatory Level 4 hazardous materials cleanup. Chloe stared blindly at the thick stack of papers in her hands, her arrogant facade beginning to crack. She stammered out a weak response, asking what a federal cleanup actually meant for her construction timeline. The director looked her dead in the eye and delivered the absolute crushing blow. He told her it meant her construction project was permanently terminated. He explained that under strict federal environmental law, the current legal owner listed on the property deed at the exact moment of the toxic breach is held entirely and exclusively financially liable for the entire government cleanup operation. He pointed a firm finger at the document in her hand and told her that she was being formally served with a federal notice of liability. The estimated cost for the chemical extraction, the soil replacement, and the long-term groundwater monitoring was $3.2 million. Chloe completely froze. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a pale, trembling ghost. The designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and hit the pavement. $3.2 million. It was a number so massive, so completely devastating that her brain simply could not process it. She looked at the federal director, her voice cracking as she frantically shook her head. She started screaming hysterically, pointing a trembling finger toward the house. She screamed that it was not her fault. She shouted that it was my fault that Evelyn had tricked her, and that I was the one who had lived in the house for 30 years. She begged the director to go arrest her evil mother-in-law, claiming that I had purposely hidden the toxic chemicals just to ruin her life. She completely abandoned her proud, independent developer persona and started weeping like a cornered child, begging the federal government to give her a massive break. The director watched her pathetic meltdown without a single shred of sympathy. He calmly interrupted her hysterical screaming, pointing out a very simple, undeniable legal fact. He told her that his agency did not care about her family drama. He stated that the county property registry showed a completely valid recorded quitclaim deed, transferring the absolute ownership of the entire estate to her company just 3 days ago. He coldly reminded her that she had legally begged to own the dirt, and now she had to pay for it. He told her that the $3.2 million debt was payable immediately to the federal government, and if she failed to produce the funds, the Internal Revenue Service would instantly begin seizing every single personal and corporate asset she possessed. I switched the camera feed to get a better look at Marcus. My son was standing a few feet behind his wife, staring at the federal director with wide, unblinking eyes of pure, absolute terror. Marcus finally understood the catastrophic reality of the situation. He had legally pledged his entire inheritance, the secure family trust his late father had left him, as secondary collateral for the $2 million predatory loan Chloe had taken out just yesterday. That loan was tied directly to the limited liability company that now owed the federal government over $3 million. Marcus realized in that exact agonizing moment that he was completely, utterly bankrupt. His wife had not built him a real estate empire. She had built a massive financial black hole and dragged him straight into the center of it. He reached out and grabbed his chest, stumbling backward against the police barricade as the sheer weight of his own profound stupidity finally crushed the air out of his lungs. I sat back in my hotel chair, closing my laptop screen and taking a long, slow breath. I did not feel any guilt. I did not feel any remorse for the financial devastation raining down on my son and my daughter-in-law. They had tried to declare me mentally incompetent. They had tried to steal my legacy and shove me into a state-funded facility to die alone. They thought they were the smartest people in the room, but they had just learned a spectacular lesson about consequence. The heavy oak doors of justice had finally swung shut, and the sound was incredibly sweet. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers eventually faded from my street, but the nightmare for my son and his wife was just beginning. Through the hidden cameras, I watched Marcus and Chloe retreat into my living room. The federal agents had ordered them to evacuate the premises, but Chloe had aggressively argued that she needed to collect her personal business files before the house was permanently sealed. They were given exactly 10 minutes to grab their belongings, but they were not packing. They were completely falling apart. Marcus was sitting on the edge of my velvet sofa, his head buried in his hands, hyperventilating. Chloe was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, her crisp white designer suit now stained with sweat and dirt from the chaotic front lawn. The silence in the room was suffocating until Chloe's cell phone began to ring. The shrill electronic sound echoed through the high ceilings. I watched her look down at the screen, and the remaining color completely drained from her face. It was the hard money-lending firm. News in the commercial real estate world travels faster than a wildfire. Todd, the unlicensed contractor, had likely called his own boss from the back of the police cruiser, and word had instantly reached the predatory lenders that their massive $2 million investment was currently sitting underneath a federal hazardous materials quarantine tent. Chloe answered the phone with a trembling hand, putting it on speaker so Marcus could hear. The voice on the other end of the line was cold and utterly ruthless. The lender informed Chloe that a federal stop work order and a toxic environmental breach constituted an immediate and catastrophic default on their loan agreement. He did not care about her excuses or her frantic explanations. He demanded the entire $2 million principal back by the end of the business day on Monday. If the funds were not wired into their account, he promised to legally seize her limited liability company and completely liquidate the secondary collateral. That secondary collateral was the family trust my late husband had left for Marcus. The line went dead, leaving a heavy, terrifying silence in my living room. Marcus slowly lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, staring at his wife with a mixture of absolute terror and rising intense hatred. He stood up, his voice shaking as he asked her what they were going to do. Chloe immediately went on the defensive, screeching at him at the top of her lungs. She blamed Marcus for the entire disaster. She screamed that he should have known about the industrial dry cleaning tanks buried under his own childhood home. She called him useless and stupid, claiming that he had dragged her into a toxic wasteland and ruined her pristine professional reputation. Marcus finally snapped. The years of quiet submission to his demanding wife completely vanished under the crushing weight of his sudden bankruptcy. He stepped toward her, screaming right back. He reminded her that it was her brilliant idea to forge the quitclaim deed. He shouted that she was the one who insisted on hiring a cheap, unlicensed contractor to dig an illegal underground parking garage just to feed her massive ego. He looked around the beautiful historic living room they had planned to destroy and broke down, sobbing. He told Chloe that his father had worked his entire life to build that trust fund, and because of her incredible greed, it was completely gone. Their marriage built entirely on shallow ambition, and stolen money was violently imploding right in front of my hidden cameras. I watched them tear each other apart without feeling a single ounce of pity. Desperation is a very dangerous emotion. When a greedy person is pushed into a corner, they do not accept responsibility. They look for a scapegoat. Chloe wiped her running mascara, pulled out her phone, and frantically dialed her corporate lawyer. She kept the phone on speaker, allowing the hidden microphone in my wall clock to capture every single desperate word. She quickly explained the catastrophic situation to her attorney, pleading for a legal loophole to escape the $3 million environmental fine and the defaulting loan. Her lawyer listened to the chaotic story and then delivered a piece of incredibly dark legal advice. He told Chloe that the Federal Environmental Protection Agency holds the legal owner on the property deed entirely responsible. The only possible way to shift the massive $3 million liability away from her limited liability company was to prove that the quitclaim deed was completely invalid. He told her she had to go to the police and formally admit that the deed was a forgery. But to save herself from federal prison, she needed to claim that I was the one who forged it. She needed to spin a wild story, claiming that I had secretly transferred the property into her name to intentionally frame her for the toxic cleanup. It was an absolutely insane, desperate strategy, but Chloe clung to it like a life preserver. She thanked her lawyer and ended the call, a wicked, frantic smile returning to her face. She turned to Marcus and told him they were going to the police station first thing Monday morning to file a formal fraud report against me. She truly believed she could lie her way out of a federal disaster. She thought she could manipulate the justice system one more time to push the devastating consequences back onto my shoulders. But Chloe completely underestimated the man I had chosen to represent me. I immediately called Sterling and told him exactly what they were planning to do. Sterling did not even wait for Monday morning. He spent his entire weekend drafting a massive, airtight legal assault. Before the local police precinct even opened its doors on Monday, Sterling was standing in front of a federal judge filing an emergency injunction that permanently froze every single asset tied to Chloe and Marcus. When Chloe and Marcus confidently walked into the downtown courthouse on Monday afternoon to file their false police report, they were immediately intercepted by Sterling. He was standing in the grand marble lobby, holding a thick leather briefcase, looking like an absolute legal executioner. He did not raise his voice. He simply handed Chloe a massive stack of stamped court documents. He informed her that a federal judge had just granted an emergency freeze on her limited liability company, firmly locking her in as the sole legal owner of the contaminated property. Chloe tried to scream that the deed was forged, but Sterling calmly pulled a single piece of paper from his briefcase. It was a printed screenshot of the text message Marcus had sent me just a few days prior. "We own the house now. You have 48 hours to move to the facility." Sterling read the text message out loud, his deep voice echoing across the marble lobby. He looked Chloe dead in the eye and explained that this single text message proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had willfully, intentionally, and aggressively claimed absolute ownership of the property. They could not claim the deed was a mysterious forgery designed to frame them when they had actively used that exact deed to illegally evict a senior citizen from her primary residence. Sterling told them that the text message was undeniable proof of extortion and elder abuse. By sending that message, Marcus had completely cemented their guilt. They had proudly claimed the stolen empire, and now they were legally chained to its burning ruins. Chloe collapsed onto the hard marble floor, her legs completely giving out beneath her. Marcus simply stood there, staring blankly at the legal papers in his hand, completely destroyed. The reversal they had so desperately counted on was dead on arrival, and the absolute finality of their ruin was finally setting in. Monday evening settled over the city like a heavy, suffocating blanket, dropping a profound and terrifying silence over Marcus and Chloe. After their devastating encounter with Sterling at the downtown courthouse, they had retreated to their expensive rented apartment. The reality of their situation was absolutely inescapable and completely catastrophic. They were trapped in a financial and legal nightmare with absolutely no way out. The federal judge had granted an emergency injunction that permanently froze Chloe's newly formed limited liability company, firmly locking her in as the sole legal owner of the contaminated property. They were facing over $3 million in mandatory federal environmental fines, a defaulted $2 million predatory loan, and imminent federal indictments for real estate fraud and elder abuse. Marcus sat on the edge of their modern leather sofa, staring blankly at the blank television screen. He was completely paralyzed by fear, his breathing shallow and rapid. He had lost his father's entire trust fund, and he was looking at the very real possibility of spending years in a federal prison. But Chloe did not freeze. Her mind, operating on pure frantic desperation, completely snapped under the immense, crushing pressure. People who are addicted to their own arrogance rarely accept defeat gracefully. Instead, they double down on their own delusions. Chloe began pacing the length of their pristine living room, muttering to herself, running her trembling hands through her messy, blonde hair. The high-priced corporate lawyer had told her that the only possible way to escape the federal environmental liability was to prove that I was the one who ordered the illegal excavation. But Sterling had already presented the extortion text message, proving that they had illegally evicted me. Chloe realized that if she could somehow reverse the physical narrative, she might be able to create enough reasonable doubt to save herself from complete ruin. She stopped pacing abruptly and turned to Marcus, her eyes wide and wild with a deranged, terrifying clarity. She told her husband they had to find me immediately and physically force me back into the ancestral home. Her plan was entirely unhinged and completely divorced from reality. She wanted to drag me back to the condemned house, unpack my suitcases, and stage the living room to look exactly like I had never left. She reasoned that if the local police and the federal investigators found me living comfortably inside the house, she could claim the text message was just a silly misunderstanding. She would tell the federal judge that I was a deeply confused elderly woman who had forged the property deed myself to avoid paying city taxes. She would claim that in a fit of severe dementia, I was the one who had hired the unlicensed contractor to dig up the basement. It was a massive, incredibly stupid gamble, but cornered rats do not think logically or clearly. They only look for the nearest exit, no matter how dangerous it is. Marcus, completely broken and terrified of losing his freedom, nodded slowly, agreeing to the violent, desperate plan. He was willing to sacrifice his own mother to save his own skin. But they had a major logistical problem. The heavy oak front door of my home had been secured by the federal hazmat team, and my new brass deadbolts were still engaged. They needed serious muscle to break into the house. Chloe picked up her phone and frantically dialed Todd. The unlicensed contractor had been released on bail late Sunday night, and he was absolutely furious. His heavy machinery had been impounded by the federal government, and his entire shady business was ruined. Chloe lied through her teeth, promising Todd a massive, untraceable cash payout from a secret offshore family account if he helped them break into the house one last time. She told him it was the only way he would ever get his impounded heavy equipment back from the city. Todd, blinded by his own intense anger and profound greed, agreed to meet them at the house early Tuesday morning, bringing his heavy steel sledgehammer. While Chloe was busy hatching her deranged criminal conspiracy, I was sitting comfortably in my luxury hotel suite, having a quiet, highly strategic phone call with Sterling. I knew human nature intimately. I had spent 30 years watching corrupt corporate developers and desperate slumlords do incredibly stupid illegal things when their backs were pushed tightly against the wall. I told my lawyer that Chloe would not just surrender to the authorities, she would try to physically rewrite the narrative to save herself. I knew she would attempt to force me back into the house to frame me for the federal disaster. Sterling agreed completely with my assessment. He told me he had already spoken at length with the local chief of police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents, who handled major real estate fraud and elder abuse. They had reviewed the hidden camera footage and the forged quitclaim deed, and they were completely ready to make the final arrests. But I told Sterling I did not want them arrested at their apartment. I wanted to catch them in the absolute undeniable act of attempting to break in and assault me. I wanted to add federal trespassing, breaking and entering, and attempted battery to their incredibly long list of felony charges. So early Tuesday morning, long before the sun even began to rise over the city skyline, I checked out of my beautiful penthouse suite. I drove my car through the quiet, empty city streets, heading back to the historic neighborhood I had loved and protected for decades. When I arrived at my house, the massive white decontamination tent was still sitting on the crushed grass of the front lawn. But Sterling had arranged a temporary clearance for me. The federal hazmat team had successfully sealed the basement door and vented the toxic perchloroethylene gas, making the main floor of the house temporarily safe to enter for a short period. I carefully slipped under the yellow police caution tape and walked around the perimeter to the back of the house. I used my original brass key to unlock the heavy kitchen door and stepped inside my quiet, dark home. The air smelled faintly of industrial cleaning chemicals, but it was safe to breathe. I walked straight through the long hallway and firmly locked the heavy deadbolt on the inside of the front oak door. I pulled my smartphone from my purse and sent a single brief text message to Sterling letting him know I was safely in position. Just 2 blocks away, parked quietly out of sight, were 3 unmarked federal vehicles and 2 local police cruisers waiting patiently for my signal. I walked into the kitchen, filled my kettle with fresh water, and turned on the stove. I made myself a warm cup of sweet Earl Grey tea, moving with slow, deliberate, absolute calmness. I walked into the living room and checked the angle of the hidden smartphone camera I had set up on the tripod days earlier. The tiny red light was blinking silently, perfectly focused on the front entryway. I stood in the quiet shadows of my beautiful living room, holding my warm teacup, taking a slow, deep breath, and waited for the inevitable arrival of my foolish, desperate family. The morning light slowly began to filter through the stained glass windows, casting long, colourful shadows across the hardwood floor. And then exactly at 7 in the morning, the peaceful silence of the neighbourhood was violently shattered. The heavy tyres of a luxury SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of my paved driveway. I heard the aggressive slamming of car doors and the heavy stomping of boots marching rapidly up my wooden front porch steps. I stood perfectly still, listening to the chaotic, muffled voices drifting through the crisp morning air. Marcus began screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with that entitled rage I had spent years trying to correct. He yelled that he was getting in no matter what, and that it was his house. Chloe, shrill and dripping with condescension, ordered Todd to stop wasting time and break the deadbolt immediately, claiming they had the legal paperwork to be there. And then the first massive, deafening blow of the heavy steel sledgehammer hit the solid oak wood, violently shaking the walls of the ancestral house. They thought they were breaking in to stage a brilliant cover-up and drag me away to a terrible facility. They thought they were the predators, finally cornering their weak, elderly prey. They had absolutely no idea that as the wood began to splinter and the lock began to break, they were walking straight into a room filled with federal agents who were about to end their lives as they knew it. I took a slow, sweet sip of my tea and smiled as the doorframe finally gave way. The final blow of the sledgehammer echoed like a gunshot through the quiet morning air. The heavy brass deadbolt, which I had carefully installed just days prior, finally sheared completely off its metal housing. The solid oak door splintered violently, bursting inward with a deafening crash that shook the very foundation of the grand foyer. A thick cloud of fine wood dust and dry plaster filled the entryway, catching the golden rays of the early morning sun. I did not flinch or gasp. I sat perfectly still on the center cushion of my velvet living room sofa, the warm porcelain teacup resting steadily in my hands. Through the settling dust, Marcus strode aggressively into my home. He stepped right over the ruined pieces of the historic door, his chest puffed out with a sickening level of unearned arrogance. He was breathing heavily, his face twisted into an ugly, victorious sneer. He looked around the pristine foyer, expecting to find me cowering in a corner packing my bags or weeping over my lost independence. "Finally, you old bat!" he shouted, his voice dripping with pure malicious venom. "We told you we were coming. You have absolutely nowhere left to hide." Chloe pushed her way in right behind him, carefully stepping over the wooden debris in her expensive designer heels. She was holding a large iced coffee, looking around the house as if she were inspecting a property she had already conquered and sold. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh and told Marcus to hurry up and drag me out to the car so Todd could start boarding up the broken windows. Todd stood awkwardly in the doorway, resting the heavy steel sledgehammer against his broad shoulder, completely unaware that he had just committed his second massive federal crime in less than a week. Marcus took 3 aggressive steps into the living room, his mouth open to shout another terrible insult. But as his eyes adjusted to the lighting in the room, his voice completely died in his throat. The nasty, triumphant sneer melted off his face, instantly replaced by a look of profound, absolute terror. His jaw went completely slack, and all the color drained from his skin, leaving him looking pale and sickly. He stopped moving so abruptly that Chloe bumped directly into his back, spilling a few drops of her coffee onto the hardwood floor. She let out an annoyed groan and peeked around his shoulder to see what had caused him to freeze so suddenly. The exact moment her eyes landed on the scene waiting for them in the living room, the plastic coffee cup slipped entirely from her manicured fingers. It crashed to the floor, splashing brown liquid all over her expensive shoes. Todd let out a low, terrified gasp and immediately dropped the sledgehammer, letting it hit the ground with a heavy metallic thud. He slowly raised both of his hands into the air, instinctively recognizing the overwhelming presence of absolute authority. They had expected to find a fragile, confused elderly woman completely isolated and defeated by their relentless bullying. Instead, they found a fully armed federal blockade perfectly positioned in my living room. I was sitting comfortably on the sofa, looking absolutely regal in my silk robe. But it was the formidable wall of people standing directly behind me that completely paralyzed my greedy family. Standing to my immediate right was the chief of police. He was a man I had worked alongside for 2 decades during my tenure at City Hall, and he was wearing his full dress uniform with his gold star badge shining brightly on his chest. His hands were resting firmly on his heavy-duty utility belt, and he was staring at my son with a look of absolute disgust. Standing to my left were 2 tall, broad-shouldered men wearing crisp, dark suits. They had heavy silver badges clipped visibly to their leather belts, bearing the unmistakable bold letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were senior special agents from the White-Collar Crime and Real Estate Fraud Division. Next to the federal agents stood a sharp, serious woman holding a thick leather briefcase. She was a senior investigator for the Internal Revenue Service, specially assigned to cases involving massive corporate tax evasion and fraudulent asset transfers. And standing quietly by the brick fireplace, leaning casually against the mantel, was my brilliant attorney Sterling. He was looking at Chloe and Marcus with a terrifying, predatory smile, completely ready to deliver the legal execution. I looked at the three of them, standing paralyzed in the ruins of my front doorway. The silence in the room was absolute and incredibly heavy, pressing down on them like a physical weight. I slowly raised my porcelain teacup to my lips, taking a deliberate sip of my sweet Earl Grey tea. I carefully set the cup down onto the glass coffee table and folded my hands neatly in my lap. "Come on in, Marcus," I said, my voice completely calm and echoing clearly across the large room. "We have been waiting for you." Marcus opened his mouth, trying to form a word, but nothing came out except a pathetic, trembling gasp. He looked at the chief of police and then at the federal agents, his entire body beginning to shake violently. Chloe frantically took a step backward toward the broken door, desperately trying to escape the trap, but she was far too late. The heavy, rapid footsteps of 4 uniformed police officers echoed up the front porch stairs, completely blocking their only exit. The officers moved in quickly, standing directly behind Todd and Chloe, cutting off any chance of a physical retreat. The senior FBI agent stepped forward, closing the distance between the sofa and the foyer. He did not yell or raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, devastating authority of the federal government. He looked directly at Chloe and asked her to confirm her identity as the registered owner of the limited liability company that currently held the forged deed to the property. Chloe began to hyperventilate, shaking her head wildly back and forth. She started to babble incoherently, claiming that there was a massive misunderstanding and that she was just trying to help her sick mother-in-law clean up the house. She pointed a trembling finger at me, screaming that I had invited them over and that she had absolutely no idea the door was locked. Her desperate, frantic lies were completely useless. Sterling stepped away from the fireplace and calmly pointed upward to the tiny, hidden camera lens mounted perfectly inside the ceiling air vent. Sterling informed them that every single second of their violent break, in every loud insult Marcus shouted, and the entire destructive act of smashing the front door had just been recorded in high-definition audio and video. He told them that the footage was currently being uploaded directly to a secure federal server. There was absolutely no misunderstanding, and there was zero room for reasonable doubt. They had violently broken into a sealed federal hazard site to illegally assault a senior citizen. The IRS investigator stepped forward next, opening her heavy leather briefcase. She looked directly at Marcus and told him that she had fully reviewed the fraudulent medical conservatorship paperwork and the predatory hard money loan he had signed using his father's trust fund as collateral. She informed him that participating in a conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse in order to secure an illegal corporate loan was a severe federal offense. She promised him that by the end of the business day, his bank accounts would be completely seized, his remaining assets liquidated, and his financial future entirely erased to pay the massive environmental fines his wife had triggered. Todd, the unlicensed contractor, did not even wait to be addressed. He dropped to his knees and placed his hands firmly on the back of his head, shouting that Chloe had hired him and that he would testify to absolutely everything she did if they just kept him out of federal prison. Chloe looked at him in pure horror, completely betrayed by her own hired muscle. She spun around and grabbed Marcus by the collar, screaming at him to do something, to call a lawyer or fix the situation. But Marcus was completely broken. The absolute magnitude of their ruin finally crashed down on his shoulders. He dropped to his knees, right there in the dusty foyer, completely ignoring his screaming wife, burying his face in his hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The tough, entitled son, who had just kicked down my door and called his mother an old bat, was now weeping like a terrified toddler, realizing he was about to lose his freedom. I sat comfortably on my sofa, watching the empire of lies they had tried to build instantly crumble into dust. The trap I had so carefully and meticulously designed had sprung with flawless, devastating precision, crushing their entire lives in a matter of seconds. I did not feel an ounce of pity as the police officers pulled out their metal handcuffs. They had demanded to own my home, and now the federal government was going to ensure they paid the ultimate price for it. The grand foyer of my home was completely silent, except for the pathetic sound of my son weeping on the hardwood floor. The dust from the shattered oak door was still swirling in the morning light, casting a hazy glow over the absolute destruction of their lives. I sat on my velvet sofa for a moment longer, just watching them. I wanted to burn this exact image into my memory. This was the moment the heavy scales of justice finally balanced. I slowly stood up from the sofa, smoothing the wrinkles out of my silk robe, and walked toward the center of the room. The police officers stood rigidly at the broken entrance, completely blocking any hope of escape. The federal agents watched me with quiet respect, stepping aside to let me address the people who had tried to ruin my life. I stopped just a few feet away from where Marcus was kneeling in the dirt. Chloe was pressed hard against the floral wallpaper, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps, her eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for a lie that could save her. I looked directly at my daughter-in-law and told her she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I told her she looked at an older woman and saw nothing but an easy target, a naive widow who would simply hand over her generational wealth to keep the peace. I pointed a steady finger up toward the ornate crown molding near the ceiling. I told her to look closely at the small, dark vent. I explained that before I packed a single bag and moved into my luxury hotel, I had hired a private security team. I told her they had wired every single room in this house with invisible high-definition cameras and sensitive audio microphones. Chloe stared up at the ceiling vent, her face turning an ashen grey. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I told her that for the past week I had watched her every move from my hotel suite. I told her I watched her throw my precious family heirlooms into garbage bags, and I watched her bring an unlicensed contractor into my historic basement to plan an illegal excavation. Sterling stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase and pulling out a small wireless speaker. He placed it carefully on the glass coffee table and synced it to his smartphone. He looked at Chloe with a cold, predatory smile and told her that the federal government did not need a confession because they already had the entire conspiracy on tape. Sterling pressed a button on his phone, and the clear, crisp audio recording filled the quiet living room. It was Chloe's voice echoing off the high ceilings. The recording captured the exact moment she and Marcus had walked into the house after stealing it. The audio played Chloe's arrogant laughter as she bragged about sneaking into my home office during Sunday dinner and stealing my tax documents. Her recorded voice clearly explained how she had spent hours practicing my signature until she could trace it perfectly onto the fraudulent quitclaim deed. Then the recording shifted to Marcus. My own son's voice filled the room, agreeing with her wicked plan. He was captured on audio laughing about the fake medical clinic and bragging about how easy it was to bribe the corrupt doctor to write the phony Alzheimer diagnosis. He said his mother was too old to fight back and that the court would freeze my money forever. The sound of their own treacherous words hung heavily in the air, absolutely destroying any possible defense they could ever mount. Chloe covered her ears, shaking her head back and forth as if trying to physically block out the undeniable evidence of her federal crimes. The senior special agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped forward, his heavy boots clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He introduced himself formally and looked at Chloe with absolute professional disgust. He told her that forging a legal property deed to intentionally strip a senior citizen of their primary residence was not a simple white-collar crime. He explained that it was a severe federal felony classified under elder financial abuse and wire fraud. He told her that the penalty for this specific level of premeditated fraud carried a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison, and that the judge would show absolutely no mercy to someone who exploited an elderly family member. But the federal agent was not finished, and neither was I. I walked closer to Chloe, forcing her to look me in the eyes. I asked her if she had ever bothered to read the secondary zoning registries when she was pretending to be a brilliant real estate developer. I told her that if she had done even a fraction of the research required for her imaginary empire, she would have discovered a devastating detail about my property. I explained that 5 years ago, I had successfully petitioned the state to have my ancestral home officially registered as a state historical landmark to preserve the rich African-American heritage of our neighborhood. I watched the realization slowly wash over her terrified face. I told her that a state historical landmark is fiercely protected by severe federal preservation laws. I explained that by hiring a thug to take a sledgehammer to my front door, and by instructing an unlicensed contractor to violently smash through the original historic concrete foundation, she had not just caused a toxic environmental disaster. She had committed massive federal vandalism and willful destruction of a protected heritage site. Every single swing of that sledgehammer had added another separate federal charge to her rapidly growing indictment. The chief of police signaled to his officers. 2 uniformed cops grabbed Todd by his heavy work shirt, hauling the burly contractor up from his knees. They roughly pulled his arms behind his back and formally read him his Miranda rights. They told him he was being arrested on the spot for unlicensed toxic excavation, illegal destruction of historic property, and criminal trespassing. Todd did not even try to fight. He just hung his head in defeat as they dragged him out through the ruined doorway and shoved him into the back of a waiting police cruiser. Seeing Todd dragged away in handcuffs completely broke whatever fragile sanity Chloe had left. The arrogant, sophisticated developer persona shattered into a million pathetic pieces. She spun around and launched herself at Marcus, pointing an accusing, manicured finger directly at his face. She started screaming hysterically that it was all his fault. She lied loudly and violently to the federal agents, claiming that Marcus was a monster who hated his mother, and that he had forced her to forge the documents against her will. She shrieked that Marcus had physically threatened her into going along with the medical conservatorship because he was desperate for the money. She begged the federal agents to let her go, promising to testify against her husband in court if they just gave her full immunity. Marcus looked at his wife in absolute pure horror, the woman he had betrayed his own mother, for the woman he had sacrificed his father's entire inheritance for, was eagerly throwing him to the wolves to save her own skin. He realized in that agonizing moment that Chloe had never loved him. She only loved the financial access he provided. And the moment that access became a federal liability, she discarded him like trash. The absolute betrayal completely shattered him. Marcus fell forward onto his hands and knees, crawling through the dust and the wooden splinters of the ruined doorway. He dragged himself across the hardwood floor until he was right at my feet. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the soft silk hem of my robe. His face completely soaked in tears and sweat. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, begging me to save him. He sobbed uncontrollably, calling me Mum over and over again. He pleaded with me to tell the federal agents that it was just a family dispute. He begged me to drop the charges, promising that he would annul his marriage and spend the rest of his life making it up to me. He cried that he was my only child, and that I could not possibly let them send him to a federal penitentiary. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man kneeling in the dirt at my feet. I searched my heart, looking for any lingering trace of maternal warmth or forgiveness. I looked for the little boy I had rocked to sleep in this very house, the boy I had worked double shifts to put through college. But that boy was entirely gone. He had died the moment he walked into a corrupt medical clinic and paid a doctor to declare his own mother mentally incompetent. He had died the moment he stood by and watched his wife throw his grandfather's sacred wooden mask into a garbage bag. There was absolutely nothing left inside me but a profound, cold emptiness. I gently pulled the hem of my silk robe out of his desperate, trembling grasp. I took a slow, deliberate step back, creating a permanent physical distance between us. I looked him dead in his bloodshot eyes, my expression completely devoid of any emotion. I told him that I spent 35 years raising a son to respect his family and honor his heritage. I told him that a real son would have protected his mother, instead of conspiring to steal her home and strip her of her dignity. My voice was perfectly steady and razor-sharp as I delivered the final, absolute truth. "I do not have a son anymore," I said. Marcus let out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure despair, collapsing completely against the dusty floor. He knew it was over. He knew he had severed the final tie that could have possibly saved him. I turned my back on him and walked over to stand quietly next to my attorney. The senior federal agent gave a short, sharp nod to the police officers. The officers stepped forward, grabbing Marcus by his shoulders and hauling him to his feet. Another officer grabbed Chloe, who was still screaming and crying, trying to resist the arrest. The heavy metallic sound of steel handcuffs clicking sharply into place echoed through the grand, historic foyer. It was the sound of absolute finality, the sound of justice closing its jaws around their greed. They were dragged out of my home, kicking and sobbing out into the bright morning sunlight to face the catastrophic ruins of their own making. 6 months have passed since the crisp Friday morning when the federal government descended upon my home and completely dismantled the wicked empire my son and daughter-in-law tried to build. The wheels of justice are often said to turn slowly, but when the federal government is owed $3 million, those wheels grind with terrifying efficiency. I sat in the front row of the polished mahogany courtroom, wearing my best tailored navy blue suit, watching the final chapter of their spectacular downfall come to an absolute close. The air in the federal courthouse was cold and sterile, a fitting environment for the absolute reality check they were about to receive. Chloe did not look like a high-end luxury real estate developer anymore. She stood at the defense table, wearing a standard-issue tan prison uniform, her blonde hair completely flat and her face pale and exhausted. During the trial, she had tried everything to save herself. She had cried on the witness stand, attempting to play the role of the overwhelmed victim. She tried to blame Todd, the unlicensed contractor, and she viciously tried to throw my son entirely under the bus, claiming he was the mastermind of the entire fraudulent operation. But the federal prosecutor simply played the crystal-clear audio recordings my hidden cameras had captured. The entire courtroom heard her arrogant voice bragging about stealing my documents and tracing my signature. They heard her proudly dismiss the environmental laws. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for elder abuse, looked at Chloe with absolute disgust. When the judge brought her heavy wooden gavel down, the sound echoed with beautiful finality. Chloe was sentenced to 5 full years in a federal penitentiary for real estate fraud and the willful destruction of a state historical landmark. But her prison sentence was only the beginning of her permanent ruin. The Environmental Protection Agency and the Internal Revenue Service had completely pierced the veil of her fraudulent limited liability company. Because she had actively committed fraud to obtain the property, the federal government held her personally liable for the massive chemical cleanup. The judge ordered that upon her eventual release, her wages would be garnished indefinitely. Every single paycheck she ever earns, every asset she ever tries to acquire, will be immediately seized by the government until the $3.2 million debt is completely paid. She will spend the rest of her natural life working to pay off the toxic dirt she tried to steal. Then it was time for Marcus. My former son stood before the judge, looking like a completely broken hollow shell of a man. The predatory hard money lenders had already moved in like vultures, and completely liquidated his late father's family trust. Every single penny my husband had worked his entire life to save was gone, swallowed up by the defaulted $2 million loan. Marcus walked into that courtroom entirely bankrupt, possessing absolutely nothing to his name. He wept openly when the judge addressed him, begging for leniency and claiming he had just made a terrible mistake. But the judge reminded him that you do not accidentally bribe a corrupt doctor to falsely declare your own mother mentally incompetent. You do not accidentally evict the woman who gave you life. Marcus was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. As the bailiff stepped forward to place the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, Marcus turned his head and looked at me sitting in the gallery. His eyes were wide and pleading, desperately searching for a final ounce of a mother's mercy. I did not blink. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked right through him as if he were a complete stranger. With both of them securely locked away in federal custody, the ridiculous medical conservatorship petition was completely thrown out of court. Sterling, my brilliant and relentless attorney, filed the final expedited paperwork to quietly void the forged quitclaim deed. The county property registry was permanently corrected, and I officially reclaimed the absolute unencumbered title to my ancestral home. Because the Environmental Protection Agency had successfully targeted Chloe and her company as the responsible parties, I was completely cleared of any financial liability for the toxic cleanup. The federal hazmat teams spent 3 months safely extracting the perchloroethylene gas, replacing the contaminated soil, and pouring a massive reinforced concrete foundation that made my basement far stronger than it had ever been. When the massive white quarantine tents were finally taken down, and the federal agents handed me back the keys to my front door, I stood on my front porch and took a deep, cleansing breath. The house had survived the assault just like I had, but I knew I could not simply go back to living the exact same quiet life I had lived before. Surviving a betrayal of this magnitude changes a person fundamentally. I looked at the vast, empty spaces of my historic home and realized that keeping this massive property all to myself was a waste of its incredible potential. If my own flesh and blood did not want to honor the legacy of this house, I was going to find people who would. I used the emergency cash I had saved, along with a significant portion of my city pension, to completely restore and renovate the damage they had caused. But I did not just repair the walls. I completely transformed the entire first floor of my home. I removed the formal antique furniture and brought in massive collaborative workspaces, modern computers, and high-speed internet. I turned the grand living room and the formal dining room into a vibrant mentorship and resource center for young African-American entrepreneurs in my city. I decided to use my 30 years of experience as the city tax and zoning director to teach the next generation how to build genuine, sustainable wealth. I opened my doors to bright, ambitious young men and women who had the drive to succeed, but lacked the guidance to navigate the complex world of commercial real estate and local government. I taught them how to read property deeds, how to file for small business grants, and how to recognize the predatory lending traps that had completely destroyed my son. The house that Chloe had called a decaying piece of junk was now filled with the beautiful, vibrant energy of young people building real empires with their own 2 hands. This profound rebirth leads me to today. It is a beautiful Sunday afternoon, and the golden autumn sunlight is streaming perfectly through my stained glass windows. The incredible, comforting aromas of slow-simmered collard greens, baked macaroni and cheese, and buttermilk fried chicken are drifting through the entire house. It is time for Sunday dinner, but the people sitting around my massive dining table are very different from the people who sat here 6 months ago. Pastor Williams is sitting near the head of the table. He had visited my home a few weeks after the federal raid, offering a deeply emotional and sincere apology for allowing Marcus and Chloe to manipulate the church board. I forgave him because holding on to bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Sterling, my fierce protector and oldest friend, is sitting across from him laughing loudly and sharing stories from his early days as a defense attorney. Denise from the county clerk office is here, passing a massive plate of sweet potato pie to the young entrepreneurs who now treat this house like a second home. There are no passive-aggressive whispers at this table. There are no store-bought kale salads brought as an insult to my culture. There is no one sitting in my home calculating the value of my property or waiting for my mind to fail. There is only loud, joyful laughter, deep mutual respect, and profound, genuine love. I sit at the head of my table, looking at the beautiful faces of my community, and I feel an overwhelming sense of absolute peace. I had to endure the ultimate betrayal by my own blood to discover what true family actually looks like. I had to let my old life completely burn down to the foundation so I could build something incredibly beautiful over the ashes. Blood makes you related, but respect makes you family. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but sometimes you have to bag it up yourself. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and keep protecting your peace. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blood relation does not automatically make someone family. True family is built entirely on a solid foundation of mutual respect and genuine care. When people allow their immense greed to completely overpower their basic decency, you owe them absolutely nothing. You do not ever have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic relatives warm. Sometimes the most loving thing you can possibly do for yourself is to step back and let destructive people face the absolute consequences of their own terrible choices. Protecting your peace, your dignity, and your hard-earned legacy is never selfish, but absolutely essential. Please share your own stories of setting boundaries in the comments below and hit the subscribe button for more videos about resilience.